Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Haunt. If you're new here, please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. You can also support us by sending a super thanks on this video. Your support truly helps the channel grow. Now, relax and enjoy the story.
Story number 1. The fog had come down like a curtain hours before the sun ever thought of rising. It wasn't the thin, ghostly veil that slid across fields on cool mornings, but a living thing, thick and pearly, pressed close against the windshield. It swallowed the beam of the headlights a few truck lengths ahead, turning the world beyond into a blank, glowing wall. The highway itself seemed to appear only at the last instant, white lines and reflective markers, flowing toward the cab like they were being unspooled from some invisible reel. Daniel kept both hands loose but steady on the wheel, his fingers resting on the smooth, worn leather. The engine hummed in a low, constant tone beneath him, a vibration that traveled up through the seat, through his spine, into the base of his skull. The truck felt less like a machine tonight and more like a massive, patient animal, moving along at his command but also on its own inscrutable rhythm. There was comfort in that, in the familiar lay of the dashboard lights, in the predictable sigh of the air brakes when he eased off the accelerator on a gentle downhill slope. The world outside the glass had narrowed to that faint slice of road ahead and the occasional gleam from the guardrail. Every so often, a green exit sign would loom out of the mist, letters softened and haloed in dew, drifting past before his mind had fully read the names. Towns he would never see, side roads he would never take, each one swallowed again by fog almost as quickly as it appeared. The radio had turned into a soft murmur hours ago, a faraway station slipping in and out with the rise and fall of the highway, music dissolving into static, then returning as if it had never left. He checked the clock on the dash, 2:47 a.m. This was the hour when the world belonged to people like him, the long-haul drivers, overnight travelers, insomniac wanderers tracing invisible lines between cities. Traffic had thinned until it felt like he might be the only moving thing in this entire stretch of countryside. Occasionally, faint twin stars would appear ahead or behind, headlights or taillights blurred by moisture, but they never seemed to draw closer. By the time he was aware of another vehicle at all, it would be a rushing shadow, a hum vibrating along the side of his trailer, then twin red dots slipping back into the fog. Sleep tugged at the edges of his awareness, not in sharp, dangerous jerks, but in a slow, heavy insistence. His eyes weren't closing, but they wanted to. His thoughts weren't drifting, but they wanted to soften, to blur. The heater filled the cab with a gentle, dry warmth that made his shoulders loosen, that made the soft seat feel deeper and more welcoming than it should. He took a breath that felt too long and forced his mind to sharpen. Coffee. He needed coffee. Not the last lukewarm sip in the thermos that had been sitting there since midnight, but something hot, fresh, and bitter enough to sting his senses. He thought of the usual chain truck stops plotted out on his internal map, bright islands of neon and polished tile and humming refrigerators. None of those were close yet. This stretch of highway was notorious for its empty miles, its long patches of dark forest and dull, repeating hills. Another sign emerged, closer this time, its reflectors catching his light just right. Exit 41, Miller's Crossing Gas, Food, Lodging. He frowned slightly. The name nagged at some half-memory, something like hearing the echo of a song without knowing the lyrics. He tried to picture his route overview in his mind. He didn't remember any stop at exit 41. For hundreds of miles in either direction, he knew each familiar cluster of services, which ones had parking big enough for full rigs, which ones had coffee that didn't taste like burnt dust. Miller's Crossing wasn't any of them. Still, the notion of a hot mug and a short walk under real air, cold, wet, and bracing, pulled at him. Maybe it was new. Maybe he had just never taken that exit, always in a hurry to reach the larger stop down the line. His eyes traveled briefly to the fuel gauge, watched the needle sitting comfortably above a quarter tank. He didn't need gas yet, but there was no harm in topping off. and a few minutes off the endless, straight road might shake off the creeping drowse. The fog thickened just as he made the decision. The sign for the exit lane appeared startlingly close, its arrow a bright, dripping slash through the mist. He clicked on his turn signal, a soft, regular tick-tick in the otherwise smooth drone of the cab, and eased the truck into the gradual curve of the off-ramp. The highway melted behind him as though he'd driven out of one world and into another. The off-ramp descended into a deeper, denser patch of fog, the guardrails on either side glistening with moisture. The pavement felt slightly different under the tires, a subtle shift in texture that registered through the steering column. The roar of the highway dimmed and faded, replaced by a softer, more distant hush. Ahead, a small cluster of lights tried to push back against the grayness. As he rolled closer, details began to reveal themselves like shapes emerging from a low, slow tide. A tall sign appeared first, its metal pole beaded with droplets. Miller's Crossing Truck Stop, the sign declared in blocky, slightly faded letters. Below, changeable plastic letters announced hot meals, hot showers, open 24 hours. The logo depicted a steaming mug and what might have once been a bright red semi, its paint now dulled by years of weather. The parking lot was broader than he expected from such an unassuming sign, a wide sweep of asphalt marked with long spaces meant for rigs like his. Dim sodium vapor lamps stood at intervals, their light a pale, amber haze diffused by the fog. He couldn't see far into the lot, but he caught the hulking silhouettes of a few other trucks, their outlines softened, beadlines of moisture tracing along their trailers. Not many, 4, maybe 5. Not crowded, but not abandoned either. Relief slid quietly through him. There was something deeply comforting about pulling into a place that was already holding other sleepers, other drivers resting behind closed curtains, engines ticking as they cooled. A kind of small, temporary community of strangers, all sharing the same road, the same loneliness. He eased into an empty slot near the building, killed his headlights, and listened as the engine's rumble dwindled away. The sudden quiet felt huge, like stepping into a vast empty hall. Only the soft pinging of hot metal cooling under the night air, the distant hum of some rooftop unit, and the faint whisper of wind disturbing the fog created a thin, steady background. For a moment, he simply sat there, hands resting on the wheel, letting his eyes adjust to the new darkness. The interior of the cab felt strangely separated from the outside now, a snug capsule of familiar smells, fabric. Coffee, a faint hint of engine oil, set adrift in an unknown sea of mist. He could see the diner through the windshield, a long, low building with big front windows glowing a warm yellow, slices of interior light shining through the white veil. A red neon sign above the entrance buzzed softly, the letters flickering but legible, Miller's Crossing Cafe. He pulled on his jacket, feeling the coolness of the fabric against his warmed arms, and opened the door. The air that rushed in was cold and wet, a quiet shock to his senses. When he swung down from the cab and his boots touched the asphalt, a fine mist kissed his face and collected on his eyelashes. The fog here wasn't just seen. It was something he could feel collecting on his skin, taste faintly on his lips, an almost metallic tang beneath the clean, damp scent. The silence was deeper outside. The world seemed wrapped in cotton. The distant shapes of the other trucks were ghostly, their many reflective surfaces catching and reshaping the scattered light into muted glows. Here and there, a cab light burned, hazy and faint. No one moved. No doors slammed. No diesel engines idled. Everything felt paused, suspended. He walked toward the cafe, his footsteps muffled. As he approached, the details within the fog-dimmed windows grew clearer. The squeak and shimmer of a rotating dessert case, the gleam of chrome-edged stools along a counter, the comforting repetition of booths with vinyl seats. The glass was checkered with beads of condensation on the inside, softening the shapes even further, making it all seem like something seen in a dream. The door handle was cool and solid in his hand. When he pulled it open, the immediate wash of warm air, carrying the sense of brewed coffee, frying batter, and something faintly sweet, folded around him like a blanket. A tiny bell above the door chimed with a bright, old-fashioned sound that lingered in the air a second longer than it should have. Inside, the cafe looked like it had been pulled straight from another decade and preserved without complaint. The linoleum floor bore a polite, almost glossy wear. The walls held framed black and white photographs of trucks from much older days, their boxy shapes and round headlights lined up with pride beside faded snapshots of smiling people in aprons, standing in front of a building that looked remarkably like this one. A long counter cut down the center, its surface worn smooth from countless elbows and coffee cups, and behind it, a chalkboard listed daily specials in looping, careful handwriting. There were more people than he'd expected at this hour in such a remote place. A man in a denim jacket sat hunched over a mug at the far end of the counter, his cap pulled low, a half-eaten slice of pie in front of him. A woman with tightly curled hair and a warm sweater occupied a corner booth, a notebook open by her plate, pen resting idle in her hand. Two older men, judging by their vests and the trucker caps resting beside their plates, talked quietly at a table near the back. Their conversation, a gentle murmur under the soft clink of cutlery, and the low hum of a jukebox against one wall. What struck him more than the number of people was the atmosphere. It wasn't merely calm, it was still. The diner felt like a place that had settled into itself decades ago and had never been disturbed since. The low lighting, tinged with amber, made corners soft and edges round. The sounds, quiet conversation, the low shuffle of feet from the kitchen, the occasional hiss of a fryer, were oddly distant, as if heard slightly through cotton, just like the world outside. "Sit wherever you like, hun," came a voice from behind the counter. The woman who'd spoken wore a pale blue uniform dress under a white apron, her name, Marlene, embroidered above her heart. Her hair was pinned back with practiced efficiency, and her eyes, though slightly tired, held an easy, steady kindness. She might have been any diner waitress in any small town, and yet something about her seemed as fixed as the furniture, as rooted as the building itself. He slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seat folding around him with a familiar squeak. From here, he could see a softened reflection of the parking lot in the glass, the dim shapes of trucks and lamps blurred into indistinct patches of light and shadow. Inside and outside overlapped in the pane, merging the foggy lot with the cozy interior until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Marlene appeared at his table almost immediately, a pot of coffee in one hand, a thick, white mug in the other. "Late night," she observed, setting the mug down with a soft clink. The coffee flowed dark and steady, steam curling up into the air. Road, a lonely place in this kind of weather. "Yeah," Daniel agreed, fingers wrapping around the mug, grateful for its heat. "Didn't even know this place was out here. Guess I just never took this exit before." "Oh, we've been here a long time," she smiled, small and fond. "Folks find us when they need to. Fog brings them in more often than not." The words settled into him strangely, like a rock dropped quietly into still water. They didn't sound odd, not exactly, but they tugged at that same part of his mind that had twitched when he'd seen the exit sign. He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, slightly bitter, but in a way that felt honest and grounding. "You got anything hot to eat?" he asked. "Something simple, eggs maybe, toast." "We can do that," she said, nodding. "Breakfast specials always on. How do you like your eggs?" "As long as they're there, I'm happy," he replied, and she gave a small laugh. She scribbled quickly on her notepad and glided away, leaving him with the coffee and the quiet murmur of the room. He let his gaze drift, not with the sharpness of someone on alert, but with the relaxed interest of the exhausted. The man in the denim jacket lifted his mug with hands that looked worn and capable, his nails rimmed faintly with engine grease. The two older men in the back nodded slowly as they spoke, one tracing invisible diagrams in the air with a fork. The woman with the notebook turned a page thoughtfully, though her eyes seemed more focused on some distant thought than on the paper. There was something similar about them, though he couldn't quite decide what. Not in their faces, not in their clothes, but in the way they held themselves. An evenness, a calm. No one seemed rushed. No one fidgeted with a phone or checked a watch. The clock above the kitchen door showed 3:02 a.m., its hands moving in quiet, steady ticks. Outside the window, the fog seemed pressed against the glass, luminous and opaque, as if the world beyond had been replaced with a pale, glowing cloud. He couldn't see the highway anymore. He couldn't see the trees or the fields, or even the sign at the entrance. Only the faint, softened halos of the lamps and the blurred, resting hulks of trucks. His food arrived sooner than he expected. A plate of eggs, toast, and hash browns, all steaming gently in the warm air. The eggs were fluffy, the toast buttered just to the edge, the hash browns golden and crisp along their edges. It looked like something from a photograph pinned to a fridge door, an idealized version of diner food, familiar and complete. He ate slowly, savoring the simple comfort of it, each bite anchoring him a little more firmly in the present. The coffee seemed to cut through the last of the heavy sleep that had been pressing at his skull, replacing it with a quiet, alert clarity. Time, unhurried, passed. At some point the jukebox shifted songs, its selection almost too soft to make out. A slow, old tune, something with a gentle guitar and a voice that might have been recorded decades ago, drifted through the space like a distant memory. The man at the counter stood up, nodded to Marlene, and left a few bills neatly arranged under his plate. As he walked past, Daniel caught the faintest hint of something in the man's expression, a tired peace, maybe, or a content resignation. It was hard to name. The bell above the door chimed softly as he left, letting in a brief tendril of fog that curled around the threshold before dispersing. No cold draft accompanied it, no sharp intrusion of night air. The warmth of the diner remained intact, unbothered. Long way still to go, Marlene asked when she came by to refill his mug. "Couple 100 miles, Daniel said. "After that, I can sleep for as long as they'll let me." "You'll make it," she replied, her tone as certain as if she were commenting on the weather. "Once you've had a rest and gotten your bearings back, road seems clearer. Just remember to take it slow through the fog. It plays tricks, you know." He hesitated, then decided to ask. "This place, I run this route a lot. I know most of the stops along it, but I've never seen Miller's crossing on my charts. How long have you all been here?" Her smile deepened, but her eyes didn't waver. "Oh, we've been here a while. There are a lot of miles out there, a lot of exits folks pass by without thinking. Sometimes the road gets long, and it's easy to forget there are quieter places tucked away in the mist, places that don't always show up on the first map you look at." That answer should have sounded evasive. Instead, it settled into him like a lullaby, smoothing the edges of his curiosity. The fog seemed to press a little closer to the windows, like a curtain drawn gently just a bit tighter, making the light inside feel even warmer by contrast. By the time his plate was clean and his coffee cooled, the tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying in his shoulders and jaw had eased. The thought of returning to the truck, to the empty ribbon of highway, no longer felt so heavy. It felt manageable, like stepping from one small island of light to another. He paid at the counter. The amount was almost startlingly low, numbers that seemed more at home decades ago. Cash only, of course. The register gave a mechanical ring when it opened that he hadn't heard in years, something actual and solid compared to the quiet beeps he was used to. When she handed him his change, her fingers brushed his palm just briefly, and there was a steadiness in that touch that made him meet her eyes. "Drive safe, Daniel," she said, with the easy familiarity of a neighbor seeing someone off. He hadn't told her his name. He thought about saying so, about making a small joke of it, but the words didn't quite form. The moment slid by as gently and completely as a leaf drifting down a slow river. Instead, he simply nodded. "Thanks, for the coffee and the quiet." "That's what we're here for," she replied. "Fog won't last forever, neither does the night." The bell chimed again as he stepped back out into the cool embrace of the mist. The fog closed around him like a soft, damp envelope, and the warmth of the diner's interior became a golden rectangle at his back. He walked slowly toward his truck, feeling the fine droplets gather on his lashes again, listening to the muted sound of his own footsteps. When he climbed back into the cab, the familiar smells and shapes greeted him as if he'd been gone only a moment. He sat for a while without starting the engine, hands on the wheel, eyes resting on the faint glow of the cafe through the fog. He could see the front window, dim and blurred, the suggestion of movement within. It felt like looking at a scene through frosted glass, real and unreachable all at once. At last he turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, vibrations returning like a steady heartbeat. He eased the truck into gear and rolled slowly out of the lot, tires whispering over wet pavement, lights carving a small, hesitant path through the white. Finding the on-ramp took longer than it should have. The fog thickened for a few moments, turning every dark patch of asphalt into a possible road and every drift of mist into a possible sign. Still, the familiar green shield of the interstate appeared eventually, its letters softened and pale. He merged back onto the highway, the empty lanes unfurling ahead. After a mile or two, curiosity nudged him. He glanced in his side mirror, expecting to see, through the haze, the faint glow of the truck stop's lights receding behind him. There was nothing. Only the gentle, diffused shine of his own taillights reflecting off the fog and the suggestion of endless dark trees beyond the guardrail. No tall sign, no glowing cafe windows, no amber parking lot lamps, just the blank, softly luminous void of early morning mist. The feeling that rose in his chest wasn't fear. It was something quieter, an ache of uncertainty softened by an even deeper sense of reassurance. He looked forward again, watching the white lines pass under his wheels, each one appearing just in time, each one guiding him onward. He considered pulling out his phone, checking a map for exit 41, but the thought drifted away almost as soon as it came. The road demanded his attention. The fog, true to Marlene's warning, did its best to play tricks, turning gentle slopes into looming descents, smoothing the edges of gentle curves until they seemed sharper than they were. He drove carefully, each mile measured and deliberate. Hours later, when dawn finally began to thin the darkness and the fog started to lift, the world returned in layers. First the guardrails, then the faint impression of fields and distant tree lines. A pale stripe of color touched the horizon, turning the sky from black to deep indigo to soft, washed-out blue. Shapes acquired edges again. Road signs became legible well before he reached them. He passed exit 40, its sign clear and ordinary, listing a handful of gas stations and a fast food chain. Then exit 42, then 43. No mention of Miller's Crossing. No exit 41. When he stopped at a large, busy truck plaza further down the line, surrounded by rows of modern rigs and the harsh brightness of LED lights, he asked a couple of other drivers if they'd ever heard of a place by that name. They frowned, thought hard, shook their heads. No, they said, no such stop on this route. Closest thing sounded like a town 3 states over. Maybe he'd crossed a state line half asleep and not noticed. Maybe he'd taken a detour he didn't remember. Maybe. As the day wore on and the miles passed, the need to explain softened. The memory of the fog-wrapped parking lot, the warm light through the misted windows, the steady kindness in Marlene's eyes settled into him like an old song. When the nights ahead grew long and the weather closed in around the cab, he would find himself thinking of that small diner, of hot coffee and the quiet murmur of low conversations, of a jukebox playing songs older than he was, of a place where time seemed to move just a little differently. On later trips, he would watch for the sign out of habit, eyes tracing every green board that emerged from darkness or drizzle. He would never see exit 41 Miller's Crossing again. The maps on his dashboard and his phone showed a long, unbroken stretch of highway where that exit should have been. Still, whenever the fog pressed close, and the world narrowed to that small circle of light ahead of his hood. Some deep part of him remained oddly calm. The road might be lonely, but he had once found a warm island hidden in the mist. And who could say with absolute certainty that it was gone for good? Somewhere in the white distance, beyond where headlights could reach, there might be another faded sign waiting, up there in the glow, just long enough for tired eyes to catch. Story number 2. Long before midnight, the mountains had already shut the world in. The highway curled around their flanks in slow, patient arcs, a narrow ribbon of pavement pressed between sheer rock on one side and a black, unseen drop on the other. Fog had climbed up from the valleys and settled across the slopes, thick and cold and strangely luminous, so that the road seemed to float in an endless, pale gray sea. Claire's rig moved through that sea like a ship, its headlights pushing out a pair of short tunnels before being swallowed. The beams cut no further than the next bend. Beyond that, nothing but the soft, milky glow and the suggestion of invisible distance. Inside the cab, everything was small and familiar. The dashboard cast a gentle, greenish wash over the controls. The wipers traced metronome arcs, clearing beads of moisture from the glass just long enough to watch more collect. The hum of the engine under her feet was steady and comforting, a deep vibration that resonated up through the seat into her lower back. The heater sent out a controlled warmth that kept the chill pressed firmly to the outside of the glass. She had driven at night for years. She knew the way darkness layered over the road, how distances changed, how light could lie. But the fog added something different, an intimacy almost. It brought the world close and softened its edges. Under its weight, she felt oddly cocooned, just her, the truck, and a few dozen yards of pavement in either direction. The temporary detour route was new to her. The main interstate further west was closed overnight for ongoing construction, and dispatch had sent a quiet message hours ago. Take State 7 through the pass instead. Add an hour to the schedule. Be careful up there. Fog tonight. Mile 172, she murmured aloud, more to the cab than to herself. Next rests around 140, then coffee, then flat land. The last mile marker had been easy to read. It had slid past on the right-hand shoulder, green and reflective, the numbers glowing briefly in her headlights. 172. She had marked it in her mind like a small flag pinned on a map. 40-ish miles to the next rest area. A few more gentle climbs, a few more descents. Nothing the truck couldn't handle. Her hand sat easy on the wheel, fingers curled light but certain. Outside, the mountain pressed close. On the right, wet rock rose in a dark wall, its rough surface catching and scattering the light into tiny, damp sparkles. On the left, the guardrail traced the drop-off with its own series of reflective studs, each one flaring briefly as she passed, like a trail of small, patient eyes. The CB sat quiet, a dormant presence in the console. The music station she favored had faded into pure static once she'd started climbing. She had switched it off a while ago. Now, the cab's soundscape was composed of engine, wind, wipers, and the occasional soft clatter from the sleeper behind her when the truck hit a rougher seam in the road. The fog thickened as she climbed, closing in tighter, its texture changing subtly. It became less like mist and more like very fine fleece pressed to the windshield. Each sign, each reflector, each tree that stood close enough to the shoulder emerged out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, as if stitched into a moving backdrop drawn along with her. A new mile marker rose out of the whiteness on the right, shining softly. 172. Her eyes picked out the number, and for a heartbeat her mind accepted it without question. Then, as the sign slipped behind her, something nudged at the edges of her awareness. She frowned slightly. "Did I miss one?" she asked the empty cab. "No, that can't be right. The last one was." It had been 172. She replayed the image in her mind, the particular tilt of the sign, the way the base was surrounded by a small ring of winter-yellowed grass, the exact arrangement of raindrops on the metal as her headlights had swept over it. Perhaps she had misread. Perhaps the last one had been 173, and her memory was folding them together. She shook her head once and checked the dashboard clock. 11:23 p.m. time was moving the way it always did on long nights, neither slow nor fast, just steadily, like a river. The road bent gently to the left, hugging the curve of the mountain. The fog flowed with it, a pale curtain drawn along invisible rails. The wipers ticked, the engine hummed, her breathing stayed even. Outside her windows, certain shapes began to feel familiar. A skeletal tree trunk standing alone just beyond the guardrail. A reflector post tilted slightly inward as though bowing to passing vehicles. A stretch of cut rock with a particular vertical seam that looked like a healed wound. Then, once more, the green rectangle of a mile marker stepped into her headlights. 172. This time her mind did not accept it quietly. Her hands tightened fractionally on the wheel. She glanced at the odometer, then back at the sign as it slid by. The numbers were clear. The reflective film glowed. No tricks there. The odometer's incremental distance since she'd last noticed looked about right. She should be closer to 170 by now, not starring again at the same number. Maybe some local highway department joke, she suggested aloud. Double posted, mile 172A and 172B. The mountain did not answer. It watched mute through trunks and stone and drifting white. The CB crackled. It was a small sound, a brief clearing of a long, quiet throat. Claire's gaze flicked to the unit, but no one spoke. Just a soft hiss of static, a rustle like distant wind moving through high leaves. She reached toward the knob, hesitated, then turned the volume up just slightly. The hiss grew clearer, the texture of it more defined. No voices, no music, just empty, gently shifting noise. The next curve bent right, the truck leaning with it in the comfortable, predictable way it always did. Her eyes traced the edge line, the center line, the faint impression of grooves where countless tires had passed before. She was not lost. She was on the correct highway. Her GPS screen showed her a simple, sinuous path ahead, the little arrow steadily moving forward. The unit, though, had lagged in the thick cover earlier. She did not entirely trust it here. More rock face on the right, more guardrail on the left. The mountain held its breath, listening. Another marker rose, emerging from the fog as if she had conjured it. 172. She watched it pass, watched the glow of her own headlights roll over the wet paint. The white numerals were crisp. The reflective coating caught every drop of light. The repetition was impossible, and yet the impossibility felt strangely gentle, as if the world had quietly misplaced a few miles and had decided not to argue about it. The CB came alive again, this time with more than static. Watch that curve eastbound, fog's thick as soup tonight. The voice was male, but softened by static, wrapped in a texture that made it sound old, like a recording. There was a faint echo, too, as if the sound were bouncing off distant canyon walls before reaching her speaker. The diction was clipped in a way that tugged at a memory, phrases she'd heard in stories from drivers who'd started long before she was born. She lifted the handset. Eastbound at 172, she said, voice calm, professional. Copy that on the fog. Silence pressed in. Static hissed, leveled, settled. Anybody else out here on 7 tonight? She tried again. You've got Claire and the white reefer headed downhill. More silence. Then, very faintly, as if from a great distance, she ain't gonna make it through that slide if she keeps her foot in it. The words were not a direct response. They sounded like a fragment from an older, longer sentence, torn loose and drifting. Her hand tightened around the mic. You're breaking up, she said. Say again on the slide. Nothing, only the small, shifting whisper of the ether. She set the mic back in its cradle with deliberate care, eyes returning to the road. She adjusted her posture, rolled her shoulders, breathed in, breathed out. The heater hummed a little louder as it compensated for a slight adjustment in the dial. The truck's frame vibrated gently around her. Another familiar tree emerged in the fog, branches bare and reaching. Another crooked reflector post. Another seam of rock with its vertical crack like a closed eyelid. The next marker, when it appeared, did not surprise her. 172. She watched it as one might watch the turning of a tide, a phenomenon both inevitable and quiet. Some part of her wanted to test the limits of this odd loop, to slam the brakes, to put the truck in park beside the sign, to step out onto the damp pavement and press her hand to the painted numbers to see if they were real. Instead, she maintained her speed. The rig was too heavy, the shoulder too narrow. Experimentation would come second to safety, always safety. Her mind, trained by years of monotony and occasional genuine emergency, began to sort through possibilities. The odometer was perhaps malfunctioning. The signs might be misnumbered. She might have missed a sharp turn, circling some large loop that rejoined the same stretch of road again and again. But the alignment she felt through the wheel, the gradual descent now, the weight of the trailer behind her easing forward on each subtle downhill, told her she was making progress. The air smelled slightly different, too. There was a hint of damp earth replacing the sharper cold of higher altitude. The fog, though just as thick, seemed to sit a little lower. The CB cracked once more. 72 eastbound, you hear me? The voice was clearer now, much closer to the present. It carried the same grain of age, but the static lay over it more lightly. Claire lifted the handset. Gotcha in there. This is eastbound reefer at Well. She glanced at the shoulder ahead, waited out the inevitable, then saw it emerge, dependable as a heartbeat. 172. Mile 172. Name's Claire. Who's calling? A pause, then. They call me Harlan. Used to anyways. You're ridden a little high for this stretch, Claire. Mountain don't like it when you rush through her fog. Something about the way he said used to brush a fingertip along the back of her neck. Goose flesh rose, not from fear, but from a very deep awareness that something was slightly out of tune with the ordinary. I'm 40 under, she said. Fog's got me good and respectful tonight. That's why you're still talking to me, Harlan answered almost gently. Road's different now. They cut her new after the slide. You're on the safe side of it, but she remembers what she was. She watched the road, heard his words, felt the cab turn gently around another invisible bend. What slide? Rock came down one night just like this, the voice said. Fog thick, rain earlier, ground all loosened up. Took half the mountain's face with it right over the eastbound lane. Folks say you could hear it groaning before it let go. Whole curve gone, just gone, took a driver with it. Rig too. His tone wasn't dramatic. It was factual, quiet, like a story told so many times it had worn smooth. Where are you? Harlan, Claire asked, eyes narrowing slightly. Her headlights traced the guardrail ahead, the wet metal gleaming. Can't see your lights. I'm ahead of you, he replied, and in that moment, a faint glow tinted the fog far in front of her, 2 soft red smudges barely visible. He was right, taillights. Old ones by the look of them, dimmer, lower to the ground than modern standards. They hung there at a consistent distance, never quite gaining, never quite receding, just floating, anchored to some point she could not place. Copy that, she said quietly. Don't follow me through the old curve, he added. You're on the new line. Stay with it. Mile marker will try to take you back, but you don't have to go. The fog pressed closer around the cab, a soft white shroud folding and unfolding in slow pulses. The road felt subtly different under her now, smoother in some places, lined with the faint grooves of more recent repaving. Yet every few minutes, the familiar cluster of tree, rock seam, and crooked reflector post appeared again, like a phrase of music repeating with small variations. Every time the green sign appeared, 172. How many times has this happened? She asked, the question directed more to the fog than the voice. Depends on the night, Harlan said. Depends on the driver. Some folks roll on through, never know they brushed the old road at all. Some get caught in the double miles for a bit. Tired ones, quiet ones, people who listen when the mountain talks. You bane one of those, I'd say. What do I do? She asked. Next time you see that marker, he answered, and there's room enough to nose over without putting your tail in the lane, you pull right up against the rock. Kill your lights. Sit a spell. Let the old road have its turn without you in it. She glanced at the fuel gauge, the clock, the dull glow of the GPS. None of them rushed her. She had hours of drive time left. A few minutes would not undo anything. The rig was solid beneath her, the mountain steady. Ahead, the faint taillights of Harlan's truck glimmered, then faded a little into the denser fog of a valley dip. The CB hissed, quiet, almost thoughtful. The next marker appeared with the calm inevitability of a tide returning. 172. There was, just beyond it, a slightly wider notch between wall and lane, where maintenance crews had once stored equipment. The shoulder broadened by a precious few feet. Claire signaled out of habit, eased the rig over, felt the right set of wheels leave the main track and settle onto rougher grit. The truck came to a gentle halt, engine idling. The fog outside pooled against the windshield, bright in the headlights. She flipped them off. The world outside turned for a moment into pure gray. Then she dimmed the dashboard lights and keyed off the engine. The sudden quiet was enormous. It seemed to expand to fill every corner of the cab, and in that space, she could hear all the small sounds that were usually lost. The ticking of cooling metal, the soft creak of the sleeper mattress shifting as the rig settled, the distant drip of moisture from some unseen rock ledge beyond the road. She left the CB on. The static breathed in and out, a small, steady presence. Claire leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and let her hands rest open on her thighs. Her breathing slowed, matching the low rhythm of the mountain silence. At first, there was nothing but the usual hiss. Then, gradually, like an old station easing into reach, other sounds bled through. You got eyes on that eastbound Harlan. Fog's common, down awful thick on my side. A dispatcher's voice, younger, bright with a false bravado that couldn't hide the thread of worry. There were faint clicks and pops in between, the telltale signs of older equipment. Then Harlan's voice, the same one that had spoken to her, but crisper, younger, carrying less wear. Got her. She's ridden a little hot, but she'll be right if she eases off. Tell the others to back it down through 172. Rock looks hungry tonight. Soft laughter followed, overlapping voices, the easy camaraderie of drivers sharing warnings. Names and call signs blended. The fog thickened beyond the glass, but the cab remained a small, warm capsule. Static swelled, then shrank. Another voice, bass, I'm common up on the curve now. This fog's something else. Can't see 10 feet past my hood. The dispatcher answered, words clipped. Copy Harlan, take her slow. They're saying there's been some movement up there. Last patrol reported pebbles on the eastbound. A pause, the sound of an engine revving faintly, as if recorded and played back. Then nothing. No crash, no shout, no sudden cut, just an absence where more words should have been. The line stayed open, the static hissing softly into the void. Harlan, you copy. 7 base to Harlan, you on this channel. The dispatcher's voice frayed around the edges. Claire's fingers curled slightly where they rested, the only sign of the chill that worked its way up her arms. Not fear, exactly. More like standing too close to a door that had once been opened onto something that could not be neatly put back. The CB went very quiet. Then, softly, as if from a great distance and many years away, came Harlan's voice, older again, the one she recognized. Still here, base, he said. Road just changed on me is all. The static smoothed out, the texture of sound returning to its ordinary grain. Claire opened her eyes. The cab was dark, lit only by the faint indicator lights of dormant electronics. The fog outside had shifted its glow. It no longer looked like a flat sheet pressed against the glass, but more like a drifting, moving thing, threads of it swirling slowly past. She checked the clock. A single minute had slipped by. The air in the cab felt subtly different, lighter, as if a pressure she hadn't noticed had lifted. She started the engine. The rumble returned, familiar and grounding. The dashboard came back to life, green and steady. She clicked on the headlights. The beams pushed out farther this time, catching the stripes on the pavement with more definition. The fog had not vanished. It still lay thick along the road, but it seemed thinner in its own skin, as if some of its weight had been gently tugged away. She eased the truck back onto the highway, checked her mirrors out of lifelong habit, and drove on. The wheels found the main track and settled into it, the treads singing a low, even note. Mile markers continued to rise from the mist, one after another. 171, 170, 168. Each advance felt like the turning of a page to which the book had been reluctant, for a time to come. The world outside shifted in small ways. Newer patches of asphalt appeared under her lights, their color just a shade darker than the older surface around them. Yellow warning signs about falling rocks stood where none had been before, their edges bright and sharp. Their metal free of rust. A low retaining wall appeared briefly, then vanished again, its concrete still unscarred by decades of weather. When she reached the place where the old stories might have placed the slide, there was nothing dramatic to mark it. No yawning gouge in the mountainside, no visible scar. Just a slight widening of the shoulder, a smooth curve in the pavement, and off to one side, barely touched by her headlights, a small wooden cross set into the dirt. It was simple, undecorated except for a weathered plastic bouquet tied to its center with faded ribbon. In the dim light, she could just make out the shape of a tiny toy truck resting at its base, its paint peeling, once bright colors muted by years of rain and snow. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She let the truck carry her past with the same respectful pace she had held all along. The CB broke the silence with the bright voice of a present-day driver. Southbound on 7, anyone got eyes on that fog up at the top tonight? Heard it's a bear. Claire lifted the mic. Eastbound, just coming through the worst of it, she replied. It's thick but shoulders clear, road, good if you give it respect. Copy that eastbound, the stranger answered. Appreciate the heads up. Watch yourself near 172. Old-timers say that stretch likes to play memory games on folks in the mist. She almost smiled. I'll keep that in mind. You ever hear of a driver named Harlan up this way? A brief pause. You mean old Harlan Mays? Heard the stories, yeah. My granddad used to talk about him. Went over in a slide back in the 70s, they say. Some folks swear they still hear him warbling on the radio when the fog rolls in. My granddad said he told him to slow down once, saved his bacon. Probably just tall talk, but... His voice trailed off with an easy chuckle. Yeah, Claire said softly, probably just talk. She clicked the mic back into place. The rig rolled forward. The miles long since lost to the loop folded away behind her, invisible, their echoes fading into the fog. As the road began to drop more steadily, the fog unspooled. It thinned and lifted in layers, revealing first the faint glow of distant towns in the valleys, then the black shapes of evergreen stands marching down the slopes. The sky above shifted from a flat charcoal gray to something with depth, stars hidden but present behind high cloud. She glanced into her mirror once as she descended, more out of habit than expectation. For a heartbeat in the swirling white behind her trailer, she thought she saw the vague suggestion of two softer, lower taillights, red and blurred, following at a respectful distance. They flickered once, as if in acknowledgement, then were gone, swallowed completely by the thinning mist. Morning would come eventually. The rest area at mile 140 would appear out of the last shreds of fog with its bright, modern lights and crowded parking lanes. Engines would idle, doors would slam. Coffee would pour, hot and dark, into foam cups. On some future foggy night, another driver might find the mile markers along that high stretch of 7 repeating in a way that made no sense, the same green sign emerging again and again from the gray. They might hear an old voice on the CB, calm and steady, warning about a curve that no longer existed. And if they listened, if they eased off the accelerator, found a place to pull against the rock, sat for a minute in the mountain's deep, enveloping hush, the road might shift for them too, letting the past and present untangle just enough for their wheels to carry on along the safer line. The mountain, after all, remembered everything. And on nights thick with fog, when the world grew very small and very quiet, sometimes the highway remembered too. Story number 3. By the time midnight slipped past, the highway had flattened into nothing but wet black ribbon and pale gray sky, the two separated only by a soft band of white where the fog lay thickest. Out here in the low country, there were no mountains to break the air, no towns close enough to paint the clouds with orange reflections. Just miles of marshland on either side, water and reeds and dark, saturated earth, all wrapped in a cold, luminous mist. Lee's rig ran straight through the middle of it, a long articulated shadow surrounded by its own small halo of light. From the driver's seat, the world had reduced to the inside of the cab, the shape of the wheel under her hands, the glow of the gauges, the faint reflection of her face in the glass when she glanced sideways. Beyond that thin surface, the fog pressed in with the quiet intensity of a held breath. Her headlights cut a short, visible tunnel ahead. 2 narrow lanes, the bleached white of the fog line, the broken dashes in the center, and beyond them the faint swale of a grassy median before the opposite lanes appeared, almost ghost-like, then vanished into the mist again. Sometimes she could just make out the dark suggestions of reeds in the ditches, the glint of pooled water catching her beams and throwing them back in shards. The engine's hum was steady, low and soothing. The heater murmured, blowing dry warmth onto her boots and legs, battling the chill that leaked in around the edges of the doors. The wipers kept time in slow, deliberate arcs, pushing away the fine mist that continually gathered on the glass and formed tiny beads that caught every stray bit of light. It was the kind of night that had always felt strangely comforting to her, despite the work of it. The thick fog, the hour when most others were sleeping, the sense of piloting a small, self-contained island through an ocean of cloud. Inside the cab it was warm and dim and familiar. The thermos in its holder, the scuffed clipboard on the passenger seat, the small string of soft white fairy lights she kept tucked along the edge of the sleeper compartment, glowing gently like distant stars. The sign she'd passed 15 minutes earlier had promised a rest area in 20 miles. She pictured it now. The rectangle of light in the fog, the echoing tile, the humming vending machines. A place to stretch her legs, splash cold water on her face, maybe sit on the edge of the bunk for 10 minutes and just listen to the quiet without having to hold the wheel. Ahead, the road ran arrow straight. The fog thickened and thinned in subtle pulses, sometimes closing down to a tight little tunnel, sometimes relaxing enough to show a hint of the faint orange reflection of another vehicle's taillights half a mile away. The opposite side of the highway was empty, its own lanes and fog line flowing by in parallel isolation. She saw him first as nothing more than a darker shape in the pale median. A standing shape, narrow, vertical, out of place among the low grasses and fog-silvered water. At that distance, everything blurred in the mist. Her eyes tried to turn him into a signpost or a short tree. But as the rig rolled closer, the details resolved in the halogen wash. A man, alone, on the narrow strip of grass between the directions of traffic. He stood with his back to her, in a dark coat that hung straight down to mid-thigh, hands at his sides. His head was bare, hair pale enough to catch the light in a brief, dull gleam. He was positioned not quite at the center of the median, but closer to Lee's lanes than the opposite ones, as if he had been walking from somewhere and had stopped, uncertain. Her foot eased off the accelerator by reflex, the truck responding in a slow, obedient deceleration. Out here, no pedestrians belonged in the road, let alone in the median in dense fog. There were no nearby towns, no visible driveways or farm roads leading in from the marsh, just miles upon miles of lowland and water and whispering reeds. As she passed him, she turned her head slightly, tracking him with the corner of her eye. The glass blurred the details. The fog softened them further, but she could tell he wasn't facing her lane or the opposite. He was turned sideways, looking not at the road, but out into the featureless whiteness beyond, toward the dark, hidden marsh. His posture was curiously still, not frozen, not stiff, just waiting, listening perhaps to something the trucks could not hear. The fog wrapped around him without clinging, as if it had learned the shape of him and accepted it. The moments slid away. The rig moved on. The man's figure faded quickly back into the pale, grainy swirl that made up everything beyond her headlights. Lee's hand stayed firm on the wheel. Her heart had given one quick, solid thump at the unexpected sight, then settled again. Probably stranded, she murmured to herself. Walked too far looking for a signal, or drunk, or both. She checked her mirrors. There was no one immediately behind her. The emptiness of the opposite lane stretched on. No oncoming glow cut the fog. If he was waiting for a ride, she was the only one he'd seen in some time. Guilt pricked, but it stayed shallow. She had been taught again and again where the line was between kindness and danger. Stopping a full rig on a live highway at midnight in thick fog to pick up a stranger on the median crossed that line by a long margin. The safest thing she could do for him was to reach the rest area and call highway patrol, report a pedestrian in a place with no reason for a pedestrian to be. The miles continued to unwind under her. The odometer ticked upward in tiny increments. The fog seemed to settle thicker, hugging low to the ground now, pooling in gentle dips, thinning slightly on gentle rises. Once, a distant, lonely honk came drifting out of the white, one of the long, low calls of a goose or heron disturbed somewhere in the marsh. She let her thoughts wander just enough to keep herself alert, tracing whatever story might have led that man there. Maybe he'd left a disabled car down in some unseen turnout and had climbed the embankment to be more visible to passing vehicles. Maybe there had been an argument, someone storming out into the night, the other person driving away with too much anger to notice the fog. Her headlights picked out another shape in the median ahead. For a second, she assumed it was a different object, perhaps a signpost this time or the low bulk of a junction marker. But as the truck closed the distance, the lines of it sharpened into that same narrow, human silhouette. Same dark coat, same pale gleam of hair. Same position. He stood again with his back to her, just off-center in the median, turned sideways, gaze aimed into the marbled gray of the marshland beyond the shoulder. Lee's foot came off the throttle. The truck protested with a faint, deep groan, weight shifting subtly as she braked just enough to reduce speed. Her pulse, which had calmed, made another small, insistent spike. "That's not right," she said aloud, voice kept deliberately level. She did a quick calculation without meaning to. She measured the time since she'd passed the first figure, the speed they'd been traveling, the distance that should equate to. Around 10 miles, maybe a bit more. If she'd been looking for rational explanations, she might have told herself there could be more than one person, that someone else happened to be standing in an almost identical way, wearing an almost identical coat in an almost identical strip of median. But the highway had not turned. There had been no exits, no on-ramps, no intersecting roads, nothing that would have changed the basic geometry of what she saw. Just 2 lanes, median 2 lanes, repeated ad infinitum until the marsh gave way to something else. As she passed him the second time, slower now, she watched more closely. From this angle, if she had dared lean toward the passenger side window, she might have caught a glimpse of his profile, the sharpness of cheek, the downturn or lift of lips. But she stayed centered, eyes flicking between road and figure and mirror. He did not move, did not turn his head even a fraction. Whatever he looked at beyond the fog was enough to command his full, unwavering attention. The cab felt suddenly much smaller, the air inside just a touch warmer, the hum of the heater a little louder. The soft fairy lights behind her seemed dimmer, their glow more distant. The CB, which had been quiet for more than an hour, crackled softly. "Northbound on 43, a voice asked, thin and blurred by distance. "You still seeing him out there in that suit?" Lee startled slightly at the sound, then reached instinctively for the mic. "Eastbound reefer mile marker." She glanced out and caught the glimpse of green as a sign appeared and vanished through the fog. 218. "Who?" "Him." Static hissed for a breath, then the same voice came back, a little clearer. It was an older man's tone, gentle around the edges, touched with a weariness that felt familiar to her. "Reefer at 218, you'll know soon enough," he said. "You pass him once, maybe twice, depends on the night. Don't look him full in the face if he ever turns. That's what they say." Her knuckles tightened against the wheel. "You've seen him, then?" "Oh, more than once," the driver answered. "We all do if we haul this stretch on the right kind of night. Fog hugs low, air's dense. Marsh talks louder than the road, that's when he's out." The words might have arrived as a chill, but the voice carried something like sympathy. Not for Lee, but for the figure in the median. "You're saying," she hesitated, partly because the sentence sounded ridiculous forming in her mouth, partly because speaking it made it feel more real. "You're saying he is actually there?" "Depends what you mean by actually," the man replied quietly. "He was once. Walked out here from a broke-down car about 10 years back. Called dispatch from his cell. This was before the bars started getting spotty down in the dips. Told M he couldn't see nothing but fog, not a speck of light either way, and something in the marsh was mackin', a sound he didn't like. Then the line went dead." Lee scanned the roadside ahead, searching for any hint of a shoulder wide enough to pull onto, any sign of broken fencing, any suggestion of a path. There was only the endless flatness, the whisper of reeds, the pale heaviness of the air. High above the low country, the stars might have been clear. Down here, the fog made the sky a smooth, luminous lid shading from pearl to faint steel. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Nobody knows for certain," came the answer. "They found his car the next day up on the embankment. Battery dead, four-way flashers still tapping away till they wore themselves out. Driver's door was open. Footprints went down the slope toward the water, then just stopped. Marsh'll do that. Swallows things whole. They fished and dragged, but he never turned up. Not the way folks expected anyhow." The CB went quiet for a moment. All Lee could hear was the engine, the tires' soft roar against damp asphalt, the rhythm of the wipers erasing bead after bead of moisture. "Night after the search wrapped," the voice continued. "My buddy Ray hauled through here just like you're doing now. Thick fog, lonely hours. He saw a man in the median standing still as could be, staring sideways out over the reeds. Thought it was a trooper at first. Pulled his speed down, straightened up in the seat. As he went by, he said he got the worst feeling, like when you wake up out of a bad dream and don't remember it, just that you were fallen a long time." Lee remembered the slight, inexplicable weight that had settled in her chest as she'd passed the second time. Not fear, exactly. More like the pressure that came with watching someone stand at the edge of a high place and not knowing whether they were about to jump or step back. "Ray called it in?" she asked. "Oh yeah, next chance he got. Local patrol ran it, went back and forth half the night. Nothing on the cameras, nothing on foot, just fog and wet grass. But then another driver saw him. Then another. Only on nights like this. Only out here in the stretch where the marsh is deep on both sides and the air sits heavy on your shoulders." Ahead, the fog brightened in a particular way that said another vehicle was out there, somewhere in the opposite lanes. A vague silver lantern glow grew, defined itself as twin headlight discs, then swept past, leaving a brief trace of illuminated droplets in its wake. In the mirrored wash, for just an instant, Lee saw again the outline of a man in the median, standing with his back to her, coat hanging still, hair catching a ghost of reflected light. 3 times now, the CB whispered as the other driver's voice returned, softer. Folks call him the Watcher. Says he's keeping an eye on something out there in the fog, or he's waiting for a truck that never quite arrives, or he's listening for the sound that pulled him off the road in the first place. Depends on who you ask. Lee swallowed, throat a little dry despite the closeness of the mist. Her thermos sat in its holder, half full of coffee that had gone just lukewarm. The comfort of its presence tugged at her attention. She reached for it carefully, one hand on the wheel, and took a small sip. The taste was flat but familiar, an anchor in a shifting night. "Why shouldn't I look at him?" she asked. "If he turns." The older driver hesitated. "You ever stare out into real thick fog," he said at last, "and get that feeling it's right about to show you something you don't really want to see? Something that's been there the whole time but needed the mist to find the right shape." She thought of childhood mornings, stepping out on fog-drowned streets, imagining faces in the white, shapes moving just beyond her yard. She thought of late-night drives as a teenager, when a patch of scrub or a neglected pile of furniture at the side of the road could become, in the headlights' cut, a figure bending down to tie a shoe, an animal about to leap. "Yes," she answered. "Well," the voice said, "if he ever turns, he's part of that. Some folks say if you meet his eyes full on, you don't like what's waiting in there. Not 'cause it hurts you exactly, just 'cause it makes you feel the way he's been feeling since he walked down that embankment. Lost, called out to, not quite here." The heater sighed softly, clicking as it cycled. The fog outside continued its patient dance. Lee's rig glided forward through the white. "How many times will I see him?" she asked. "Depends on what kind of night it is," the man replied, "and what kind of mood the marsh is in. Some folks see him once, then the fog lifts, and that's the end of it. Some drive a whole stretch with him common and going in the median like mile markers that breathe. Me, far as I can tell, you see him until you decide who he is to you." The answer didn't immediately make sense, but it drifted down into her thoughts and settled there, quieter than her first pulse of unease, but far more persistent. She passed another sign announcing the rest area in 10 miles. The idea of safe pavement, bright lights, and open space grew more appealing with each repetition of the watcher's figure in her peripheral vision. Somewhere ahead, the fog was bound to thin. Somewhere behind, he would stay where he was, or come along in his own strange way. The next time she saw him, she made a choice. He appeared once more as a darker column in the median, the edges of his form blurred by the glowing moisture. Lee's foot lifted lightly from the accelerator, not from alarm now, but from an odd, quiet respect. As she drew parallel, she let her gaze slide over him only briefly. Tonight, in her mind, he wasn't a threat, not a specter waiting to pull someone off the road. She thought of the dead car on the embankment, the open door, the footprints ending in soft mud. She imagined the sound that might have risen out of the marsh then, a low, mournful call, or the splash of something large shifting in the water, or simply the layered chorus of frogs and insects and distant birds. She imagined freezing in a wall of white, no horizon, no sky, just the sense that something vast and unseen breathed all around you. The hum of an engine ticking down as its failing battery gave up. The darkness sliding in, made thicker by the fog. The realization that you were small and alone and far from any house with a porch light burning. She decided, absurdly and completely, that he was afraid. A man who had gone seeking the source of a sound, or the promise of another set of headlights, and had never quite found either. A man who stood, still and listening, caught in the moment just before a choice he hadn't been able to undo. She didn't look at his face. She didn't try to see his eyes. She didn't let her imagination dress him up with horror. She let him be what the night had made him, a watchful, waiting figure between lanes, neither here nor entirely gone. "Hope you find what you're looking for out there," she said under her breath as she passed. Between one sweep of the wipers and the next, the air changed. It was subtle, the way the pressure shifted. The fog grew looser, its grip on the shoulders less absolute. The light bouncing back from it dulled just a touch, as if its density had eased. Lee's headlights began to reach a little farther down the road, catching the reflective sparkle of a distant sign earlier than they had all night. The CB crackled once, then quieted. The older driver's voice did not return. She had the faint, irrational impression that he'd stepped away from his mic to watch something through his own windshield, wherever he was, as if a curtain had just lifted. The next time she scanned the median, out of habit rather than expectation, there was nothing there but a low, fog-softened hump of grass glinting with moisture. No silhouette, no coat, no pale curve of hair catching the light. The rest area's entrance appeared ahead at last, its ramps and loops emerging from the thinning mist in neat geometry. Sodium lamps glowed a warm, diluted orange through the last clinging layers of cloud. The shape of the building took form, concrete block and glass, a neutral haven. She eased off the highway, feeling the small shift as the truck climbed the gentle incline. Gravel crunched under her tires when she moved into one of the long truck spots. The sense of motion, relentless and one-dimensional, finally relented. When she stepped down out of the cab, the air that met her was cold and damp but no longer pressing. The fog here was lighter, moving in tatters across the parking lot, giving glimpses of starless sky and shadowy tree lines before closing again. The world had edges once more. Somewhere far off in the marsh, invisible from where she stood, a bird called out, a low, resonant sound that rose and fell like a question and an answer wrapped in one. Lee paused beside her truck, breath making a faint puff in the chilly air, and listened. The call faded into the distance. The fog drifted. Tires whispered as another rig pulled in at the far end of the lot, its headlights sweeping briefly across her trailer, making the wet aluminum glow. Inside the rest area, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The tile was indeed echoing, the vending machines humming exactly as she'd imagined. She washed her hands at the sink and splashed water over her face, the coolness waking her skin, drawing her more firmly back into the ordinary. When she returned to the cab, the interior welcomed her with the familiar creak of the seat, the faint lingering smell of coffee, the soft glow of the fairy lights in the sleeper. She climbed in, closed the door, and let the quiet wrap around her again. For a moment, she sat without starting the engine, hands resting empty in her lap. The image of the man in the median came back to her, not as a jump scare, not as some leering figure, but as a still, patient presence at the edge of the road. "Hope you got your ride," she said softly, without really thinking who she might be addressing. The heater ticked as it cooled, then sighed gently as it came back on, purring as though the truck itself approved of the sentiment. Later, when she rolled out of the rest area and back onto the highway, the fog had thinned enough that she could see the faint lights of distant farmhouses scattered across the lowland, tiny islands of yellow in a gray sea. The median ran between the lanes just as before, a strip of damp grass and pooled water. She scanned it once, twice, more out of habit than fear. He was not there. The miles that followed were easier. The road felt less endless, the isolation less absolute. The radio caught a station again, some soft song winding its way through the cab, human voices and instruments weaving counterpoint to the hum of the engine. In the years to come, when fog descended on that stretch of low country and the hour grew late, other drivers would report seeing a man in the median, standing with his back to them, watching something only he could see. Some would feel a cold spike of dread, imagining all the ways the marsh could swallow a person. Some would hurry past, eyes fixed on the road ahead. A few, those who listened closely to old stories traded over coffee and diesel fumes, might slow just a bit, keep their gaze soft, and let him be what they needed him to be. A warning, a companion, a reminder that the white void outside their windows was full of forgotten things. On nights like that, in the cozy dim of her own cab, Lee sometimes caught herself glancing into the rearview mirrors, half expecting to see, far behind in the shimmering haze left by her taillights, a narrow figure standing watch in the median. When she didn't, she felt, not relief exactly, but a quiet, odd gratitude. The highway held many ghosts, real and imagined, stories layered over asphalt and concrete in countless thin, transparent sheets. Some were loud and sharp, bound up in sudden screeching breaks and twisted metal. Others were like the Watcher, soft, persistent outlines in the fog, more melancholy than menacing. She preferred those. They made the road feel less empty. Story number 4. The desert had a way of pretending to be simple, especially at night. From the driver's seat, it was easy to believe there was nothing beyond the edges of the headlights but flat earth and distant stars, an endless sheet of asphalt unrolling over a dark, quiet land. The sky arched high and empty, a black bowl pricked by a scattering of cold lights. The air was dry enough that every breath felt thin and clean, carrying the faint, mineral scent of hot rocks cooling under a vast, invisible dome. Tom's rig moved through that wide, apparent emptiness with a steady, patient rhythm. The big flatbed hummed underneath him, engine a-deep. Even thrum, tires whispering over the long, straight lanes. The straps on the load behind him, steel beams, carefully chained and checked twice, vibrated just enough to make a faint, musical clatter now and then, a tiny reminder of the weight he pulled. The dash lights washed the cab in a soft, green glow. Gauges sat where they ought to, needles steady. The CB slept in its bracket, turned on but quiet, the squelch set just right so that if anyone spoke up on the channel, he'd hear them. The only other sound was the occasionally creak from the bunk area as the truck flexed over subtle changes in the pavement. He liked this stretch of interstate at this hour. Out here on the high desert plateau, miles from any city, there was a sense of real distance, of unshared space. No headlights crowded his mirrors, no taillights pulled his gaze forward. The highway ran straight as a promise between low, barely visible ridgelines. Every 20 miles or so, a small blue sign would announce the next exit, the next services, the next nothing town clinging to the roadside. Earlier, twilight had washed the land in bruised color, purple mesas, orange dust, the last touch of sunlight catching on broken stone. But night had flattened it all, smoothing the edges, making everything beyond the shoulders into layered darkness. He checked the overhead console. Local weather had warned of ground fog in patches, something about cool air settling over warm desert after an unseasonably cold front. He'd shrugged it off. In his experience, fog here meant a few wisps in low draws, a bit of silver over distant dry lake beds. Nothing like the wet, heavy blankets he'd fought through in the Midwest or along coastal routes. Still, the idea nagged at the back of his thoughts as he watched the road. The air felt different somehow. Cooler, certainly. The faint wind from his window vent had lost its earlier warmth, bringing instead a hint of something he rarely smelled this far inland: dampness. Not much, just a ghost of it, like the memory of rain. The first whisper of white appeared low on the horizon, barely noticeable, a pale thinning of the darkness hovering just above the pavement line ahead. At first he took it for glare, some reflection from his own lights catching dust. But as the truck closed the distance, the faint light grew into something more substantial, a soft, luminescent band lying across the road. Ground fog, he thought, a little surprised by how suddenly it had settled. Out here on flat ground, it had nowhere to run, nowhere to spill off. It simply gathered in the lowest points, hugging the asphalt, thickening into a low cloud that seemed to grow out of the highway itself. He eased off the throttle gently, letting his speed slip down from a comfortable 68 to a more respectful 55. The engine tone shifted, deepened, but stayed content. His hands remained loose on the wheel, muscles remembering 100 other foggy nights, 1,000 other subtle adjustments. The rig glided into the white. Inside the cab, the change was immediate. The world beyond the windshield shrank to a small, bright box, its edges softened. The beams of his headlights, usually slicing out into the dark for hundreds of yards, were now cut clean after only a few truck lengths, the light bouncing back at him from a million suspended droplets. The white lines near his wheels glowed bright and close, then vanished into a milky, formless distance. The desert disappeared. Whatever low brush, dry washes, or scattered rocks lay beyond the shoulders, they might as well have been erased. His mirrors showed only more whiteness, swirling slowly in the red reflection of his tail lights. The highway felt less like a road and more like a bridge suspended in cloud. Tom's breathing steadied, matching the slow sweep of the wipers as he clicked them on to clear the fine beads forming on the glass. He had moved through worse. He reminded himself of this with calm certainty. Fog did not frighten him. It demanded focus, patience, respect. It pressed the rest of the world out and left him with a simpler equation: truck, lane lines, speed, time. A sign emerged from the mist on the right, startling in its suddenness. Exit 119, Old Ridge Road, no SCRVICES. The green rectangle hovered for a moment in his beams, wet and gleaming, then slipped away behind him like everything else. He knew of Old Ridge Road in the abstract, a name passed along in older drivers' stories. Once it had been the main two-lane route over the low escarpment to the east, a twisting, narrow strip of asphalt that clung to the edge of shallow canyons and dry creek beds. Before they'd built the modern interstate further south, trucks had crept along it in low gear, engines straining up the grades, brakes smoking down the other side. It was the kind of road that collected its share of wrecks even on good days. Used to be worse, one veteran had told him years ago over coffee in a dim truck stop. Before they softened the curves, before they shut it down to big rigs, fog would drop in on that ridge like a lid and you couldn't see your own bumper. Heard a whole convoy went over on a bad night back in the 80s. After that, folks said the ridge didn't want us anymore. Tom had smiled then, half listening, chalking it up to the usual seasoning of rumor and superstition that flavored long-haul talk. Every road in every region had a story. Every dangerous curve had at least 3 versions of a worst night tale. Most of them grew with retelling. Now, alone on a fog-swathed interstate with Old Ridge Road's exit sliding into darkness behind him, the memory of that story stirred with a little more weight. He checked his mirrors again, the red haze of his own tail lamps glowed back at him, soft and contained. Nothing else broke the whiteness. The CB remained a quiet, patient line of static. Even the faint sense of the desert's vast openness had vanished, replaced by a strange, close intimacy, as if the whole world had curled inward around his cab. The next sign appeared out of the mist, smaller this time. A simple white rectangle on the shoulder, its reflective surface catching and scattering his beams. Old RD-19, bridge weight 6 tons, it read in block text before disappearing back into the white. That was odd. Old Ridge Road was supposed to be well behind him now, curling north and east away from the interstate. There shouldn't have been any intersections for miles. He knew this section from maps and prior runs. The interstate here was meant to be a clean, straight line. His GPS, a solid utilitarian unit clipped to the dash, still showed him exactly where he expected to be. I-17 eastbound, mile marker 118, arrow steady. No cross-traffic roads, no exits other than the one he'd just passed. The little digital map did not acknowledge the sign he'd seen. Fog could make distance feel strange. It could compress miles into repeating sequences. Each curve and straightaway seeming like the last. Maybe he'd misread. Maybe the sign had been for an overpass he couldn't see. He drove on. After another 5 minutes of careful motion through the whiteness, the road beneath his wheels began to feel subtly different. The vibration changed, a new rhythm underneath the familiar hum. The lane stripes, which had been bright and freshly painted, now looked a little worn, their edges more ragged. The shoulder narrowed. The right-hand rumble strip, so distinctive when his tires brushed it, became less pronounced, its buzz softer, like an old song played through tired speakers. He slowed another notch, frown deepening. The The steering wheel transmitted the tiniest of shifts, a series of gentle, regular bumps, as if the truck were passing over old patchwork repairs in the asphalt. Out of the fog, a pair of faint red dots appeared far ahead. Tail lights, dim through the white, hovering at the very edge of his visibility. Relief pricked his awareness first. The comfort of not being alone, of another set of wheels on the same strange stretch, was immediate and almost physical. He felt his shoulders loosen just a little, his fingers easing on the wheel. Another driver, another witness to the weirdness of the night. He kept his distance, letting the other vehicle remain a vague presence ahead, its exact shape lost in the glow and blur. It might have been a car or a pickup or a smaller box truck. The light spread made it difficult to judge. No matter. As long as it stayed out there, moving steadily, it marked the path more firmly than any painted line could. He reached for the CB mic, thumb resting on the button, ready to call out a simple greeting, maybe trade notes on the fog thickness, confirm that Old Ridge Road sign hadn't been some trick of his mind. Before he keyed in, the unit crackled to life on its own. "Convoy, this is Lead 1. You boys still with me back there?" The voice sounded muffled, as if coming through an older microphone, the edges softer, a faint hiss underlying every word. It carried a cadence, too, that Tom recognized from his earliest days on the road, the unhurried drawl of someone who'd been talking to other drivers on a CB long before smartphones had existed. "Copy that, Lead," another voice answered, just as muffled. "Still got your tail lights. Fog's trying to eat M, but we're hanging in." He stared at the speaker as if it could offer more than sound. His thumb hovered over the transmit button, paused between impulse and caution. The truck moved on. The faint red lights ahead remained, bobbing just slightly with the unseen rise and fall of the road. The CB's tiny speaker hissed, then settled back into a shallow pool of noise. He swallowed, throat dry. Then quietly he pressed the button. "Unit ahead on 17 eastbound," he said, voice steady. "You got a big flatbed back here picking up your trail. How's it look up where you are?" Silence answered at first. Then the static shifted, as if someone on the other end were turning a knob, fine-tuning an old radio. When the voice came again, it did not sound surprised to hear him. "Fog's thick as cotton up on the ridge," the man said. "Road tight. We're keeping it to 30. A tiny beat and then curious, you part of this run or you fall in late, friend?" Tom glanced at the GPS. The arrow still insisted he was on the straight strip of I-17, not any ridge road. Yet the feel under his hands told a different story. The wheel vibrated with the imprint of old, narrower lanes. The truck rocked slightly as the pavement rose in a gentle grade he hadn't expected. He looked ahead. The faint red lights had multiplied. There were at least 3 pairs now, close together, forming a short line that stretched into the fog. The lead pair sat a bit higher than the others, as if belonging to a larger cab. All of them glowed with a softness his modern LEDs did not have, their color a deeper, almost orange-red, like the bulbs of an earlier era. "Fell in late," Tom answered, the truth simpler than any attempt at explanation. "Didn't think I was on the ridge at all, but it's looking like maybe I am." A laugh, low and warm, filtered through the static. "Well, you're here now. No harm in running with company. Name, Dalton. We're talking a line of steel through to the base yard east of the escarpment. You loaded?" "Steel beams," Tom said, glancing in his mirror at the shadow of his cargo. "Flatbed, 17 east. Name's Tom." "Good to have you with us, Tom," Dalton replied. "Just mind your distance and do what we do. Ridge don't much like loners in weather like this." The highway, if that's what it still was, curved gently to the right. Tom felt the truck lean into it, the trailer following obediently. The fog pressed against the side windows, a soft, luminous wall. The tail lights ahead dipped slightly, then rose, then dipped again, marking a terrain he could not otherwise see. Somewhere in the back of his mind, A small, rational voice reminded him that this conversation made no sense. There were no convoys scheduled on Old Ridge Road. That road, as far as official maps were concerned, was no longer open to heavy trucks at all. The interstate had taken its place years ago, smoothed it out, widened the lanes, drawn a new line across the desert. But another part of him, older and quieter, accepted what his senses relayed. The feel of the narrow pavement, the sight of weathered lane stripes, the sound of voices using call signs instead of usernames, commenting on grades and curves in a shorthand that felt like a language from a slightly different world. He cleared his throat. "Heard a story once," he said lightly, as another curve coaxed the wheel to the left, "about a convoy that went over out here in fog, years back. That ever make its way to you boys?" Static hissed thoughtfully in response. Then Dalton answered. "Stories get told," he said, "some louder than others. Ridge took her share of trucks before they eased the turns. Took a whole string of us on a night like this long before you were haulin', I'd bet." A pause. "You askin' if that's us?" Tom's fingers tightened around the mic before he realized they had. "Should I be?" Dalton's laugh was softer this time. "Depends if you're lookin' for spooks or for guides, friend. We're just runnin' steel tonight. That's all you need to know." The grade steepened. The engine's pitch shifted as the truck began to climb, weight pulling back. Tom downshifted smoothly, the familiar motions grounding. Ahead, the line of red lights moved in time with each dip and rise, close enough now that he could see their arrangement. Old-style round lamps, 3 across the top of each trailer, 2 down low on the bumper. The cab's shapes were hinted at now and then in the fog, boxier noses, straighter angles. Here and there, on the edges of his vision, the white veil parted just enough to reveal glimpses of the land beyond. To the right, the ground fell away quickly, the shallow cut of the escarpment dropping into a darkness that swallowed light. To the left, the hillside rose, studded with scrub and rock. Old wooden guardrails, their posts gray and splintered, ran along the shoulder, a tenuous barrier between asphalt and empty air. This was not the wide, gently banked interstate he had settled into hours ago. This was a narrower, older road, clinging to the side of something just high enough to be dangerous. The GPS still tracked him on I-17, as if nothing had changed. Another voice crackled through the CB, this one from farther back in the line. "Lead you seen that cross up ahead?" the driver asked, tone subdued. "Yeah," Dalton replied. "Been there a while. Give it a nod on your way by, boys." Tom squinted forward. The fog thickened momentarily, then thinned, and in that small clearing he saw it. A roadside memorial, small and simple, standing just beyond the guardrail. A cluster of wooden crosses, their paint peeled and flaked, leaned together, nailed onto a single post. Old plastic flowers clung to them like faded echoes of past color. A scrap of reflective tape caught his headlights and shone briefly. He could not see the names that might have been carved or painted there, but he didn't need to. The number of crosses, 5, told its own quiet story. As his rig rolled alongside, he felt an urge to do something, some small gesture of acknowledgement. His hand lifted from the wheel for a moment, not quite forming a wave, more like a wordless salute. The fog folded back in, as the memorial slipped behind them. "Tom," Dalton's voice came, a touch more serious now, "you're gonna feel the road try to vanish on you in about a mile. Fog likes to settle in the low cut just before the last curve. Don't trust what your eyes say down there. Trust the line. Trust the weight under you." "What about you?" Tom asked, pulse ticking up a notch. "You made it through last time." The answer came after a beat. "We're talking to you, aren't we?" He wanted to press, to ask more directly, but the grade began to fall then, pulling his focus forward. The truck eased over the crest and started down, engine brake muttering as he coaxed his speed into a controlled descent. The fog ahead brightened until it looked almost solid, a wall of white waiting to close over them. The tail lights in front of him slipped into that wall and were swallowed. For a heartbeat, he was alone again in a bright, undefined void. The guardrail on the right disappeared. The hillside on the left vanished. Even the lane lines faded, their painted edges lost in scattered light. His heart climbed into his throat, but his hands held steady. He listened to the pitch of the engine, to the subtle vibration through the wheel, to the whisper of the tires. Then faintly at first and then clearer, other sounds slid into his awareness. Engines, more than one, more than his own. A low chorus of diesels. Matched in rhythm but slightly out of sync, like a group of singers holding the same note in different octaves. He could not see the trucks ahead anymore, but he could hear the suggestion of their presence, feel the way the air seemed to move around his cab as if other large bodies displaced it. "Stay with the grade," Dalton's voice said softly through the CB, closer now, almost intimate. "Don't chase the shoulder, it isn't where you think it is. Curve's gonna lean right, then left. You'll think it's backwards. Go by how she feels under your hands." The wheel tugged gently. Not much, just enough to let him know the road wanted to bend. His eyes, nearly useless in the flat, featureless light, tried to tell him that everything was straight, maybe even veering off in the opposite direction. It was the peculiar trick of dense haze. It erased depth, made every distance seem equal. But the weight of 40,000 pounds of steel behind him did not lie. He felt the center of gravity shift just a hair as the nose traced the true curve. He leaned into it, trusting the familiar physics of rubber on road more than his sight. The descent continued longer than it should have, each second stretched by the bright, claustrophobic sameness. The fog found its own sound now, a faint rushing like static, like 1,000 tiny grains brushing against metal and glass. The unseen engines hummed their low chord around him. He realized he was breathing in shallow, measured draws and forced his lungs to fill fully once, twice. The cab smelled of dust, coffee, and faint engine heat, an ordinary comfort in an extraordinary moment. "Easy," Dalton murmured over the line, the word almost lost in the hiss. "There you go, last bend coming up. You'll feel her lift when you're past it." Time folded strangely. It might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. The bright void pressed against the glass, against his thoughts. Then, as gradually as a dimmer switch turning up, the white began to thin. First, the lane lines reappeared, their worn edges reasserting themselves. Next, the guardrail took form, stretching out along the right shoulder in a long, silver curve. Beyond it, the hint of a darker drop returned, the shape of the land re-emerging from absence. The fog pulled back into higher layers, rising off the pavement, leaving only streaks and whorls in its wake. The road straightened, the grade leveled, the truck's weight settled evenly on all wheels. Tom exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The cab felt larger again. Ahead, the tail lights came back into view, but not in the way he expected. There was no neat string of 3 or 4 pairs now, no convoy stretching into the middle distance. There was nothing at all. The highway in front of him ran empty, its surface dull and damp under his beams. The only red glow was the faint halo of his own dash lights reflecting in the windshield. He flicked a glance at the GPS. Somehow, impossibly, the arrow showed him not on a narrow ridge road clinging to the side of an escarpment, but back on the broad eastbound lanes of I-17, half a mile past the point where the new interstate curved away from the old route. The map's pale ribbon traced a gentle, sweeping path through flat terrain, no sharp S-turns, no drop-offs. His altimeter confirmed it. The rig had given up the extra height faster than it should have. In the time it took to descend that last, fog-drenched grade, he'd rejoined the lower basin, the old road and the new laid almost on top of each other. The CB sat quiet, its face a small, dark rectangle with a single green LED glowing to show it was on. Static hissed faintly, featureless. "Dalton," he said, thumb pressing the transmit. "Convoy up ahead, you boys clear." The speaker remained stubbornly mute. He waited another few seconds, then tried again. "Lead 1, this is Tom on 17 East. "You still readin' me?" Nothing answered but the soft, empty rush of a clean channel. The fog continued to lift in layers, revealing again the wider shoulders, the newer guardrail, the flat expanse of desert stretching away on both sides. The old, weathered posts were gone, replaced by gleaming steel. The shoulder patchwork smoothed out. Freshly painted reflectors dotted the edge lines. He drove in silence until the next exit sign appeared. Exit 132, Lone Cactus Gas Food. A familiar truck stop symbol accompanied the text, a small oasis icon in blue. The idea of pulling off, stepping down onto solid, brightly lit pavement, and hearing voices that belonged strictly to the present appealed more than he would have admitted. He clicked on his turn signal, listened to its reassuring tick, and guided the rig up the ramp. The fog, held close to the ground out on the open interstate, broke apart more readily here. The glow from the truck stop's canopy lights pushed it back, turning it into sliced ribbons and low patches that drifted between parked trailers. Sodium vapor lamps stood in rows, casting yellow pools on the asphalt. The rumble of idling engines filled the air, each sound distinct yet blending into a steady backdrop. He chose a slot toward the edge of the lot, eased the truck into place, and set the brake. For a moment he sat without moving, the engine ticking as it cooled, the faint scent of hot metal rising in the cab. His heart had steadied. His mind, however, felt as if it were holding two versions of the last 40 minutes at once. When he climbed down from the cab, the night air brushed his face with a cool, almost velvety touch. The fog here was just a gentle presence now, softening the edges of nearby trucks, blurring distant shapes. Gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the building. Inside, the truck stop was its own universe. Bright tile, humming refrigeration cases, the faint smell of fryer oil and coffee, the low murmur of late-night conversations. A muted television played some overnight news loop in the corner. A couple of drivers sat at a counter, shoulders hunched comfortably over their plates, talking in the quiet way of people who had been on the road too long to bother with loudness. Tom poured himself a coffee from a big, stainless steel urn and carried it to a table near the window. Outside, through the glass, he could just make out the vague shape of his own rig and a few others, the fog turning them into hulking suggestions rather than solid machines. On the wall near his table, a corkboard held flyers and notices, trucks for sale, routes offering team positions, lost items, a faded OSHA poster. Among them, slightly crooked, was a black and white photograph in a cheap frame. It showed a line of trucks parked nose out along a similar lot, their cabs squared and old-fashioned, each one bearing the same painted logo on the door, Dalton and SONS Steel HAULING. The rigs were neatly aligned, the drivers standing in front of them in a row, hands on their hips. Squinting into the sun, he stood, coffee forgotten for a moment, and stepped closer. At the center of the line, a tall man with a mustache and a baseball cap held himself with easy authority, a small smile etched at the corners of his mouth. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head, that tugged at recognition. Taped below the frame, a small typed label read, "Dalton's Last Run, Old Ridge Road Convoy, 1984. In memory of the 5 we lost on the escarpment. Roads kinder now, thanks to them." Under the printed words, someone had written in a looping, older hand, "Still watchin' the line, boys. Keep her between the ditches." Tom stared at the photograph for a long time, the murmur of the truck stop flowing around him like water. He traced the shapes of the trucks with his eyes, the old cab-overs, the rounded fenders, the pattern of the marker lights. They matched down to the spacing, the faint red glows he had followed in the fog. He could have told himself any number of reasonable things, that fatigue and isolation had played tricks on his perception, that the fog had turned the sounds of his own engine into something echoed and layered, that his mind had woven an old story into the fabric of a difficult stretch of road. Yet, sitting back down with his coffee, feeling the warmth of the mug against his palms. He found that he did not particularly want to explain it away. The memory of those unseen engines humming alongside him, of that calm voice guiding him through a curve his eyes told him didn't exist, carried a weight that felt less like fear and more like gratitude. Outside, low clouds still moved across the desert, thinning and gathering in their own slow patterns. The escarpment lay miles behind, its old road mostly forgotten under the dominance of the newer interstate. But on certain nights, when cool air dropped fast and the ground held on to the last of the day's heat, fog would rise and cling to the ridge. On those nights, drivers would sometimes talk about feeling less alone on that stretch, about seeing through the white the faint impression of older rigs just ahead, their tail lights burning a deeper, softer red, about catching for a second the quiet thread of an older voice on the CB, one that said little more than, "Easy now. You're not by yourself up here." Tom finished his coffee slowly, then headed back out to his rig. The cab welcomed him with its familiar creak and hum. When he pulled back onto the interstate, the fog had lifted enough to show a modest scattering of stars between stretched wisps of cloud. He checked his mirrors, saw only his own trailer lights drawing a pale red line through the night, and smiled to himself just a little. He would remember that unseen convoy every time he passed Old Ridge Road's exit in the years to come. On clear nights, it would just be another green sign, another story pinned to a map. But on nights when the fog dropped like a curtain over the desert, he'd feel, somewhere at the edge of hearing, the quiet company of engines that kept a ghostly run along a road that no longer officially existed. And he would, without really thinking about it, ease his speed just a hair and leave a little extra space on the lane ahead, as if making room for trucks that lived only in the shifting white. Story number 5. The mountains had a way of folding the night in on itself. By the time Marcus reached the eastern slopes, the sky had lost its last traces of color and become a deep, velvety black pressed close against the ridgelines. The highway threaded through the Appalachians in long, patient curves, cut into hillsides and skirting old hollows, its surface shiny with recent rain. On either side, the dark swell of forest rose up steeply, tree trunks packed close and damp, their bare branches knitting together overhead in tangled shadow. Inside the cab, it was warm and familiar. The dashboard cast a soft amber glow over his hands where they rested on the wheel. The hum of the refrigerated trailer behind him was a constant, subdued presence, a low purr under the deeper thrum of the engine. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, mingling with worn upholstery and a trace of cold air that seeped in around the edges of the window. He'd been running this route long enough to know the road's moods. In summer, it smelled of hot leaves and sun-baked asphalt. In winter, the air turned sharp as glass, and the trees lined themselves in frost. Tonight, early spring had left the hills soaked and soft. Patches of mist hovered in the low places, clinging to roadside ditches and creek beds, drifting up from the cold ground as if the earth itself were exhaling. The digital clock on his dash read 12:41. His headlights washed over retroreflective posts and guardrails, pulling the world out of darkness in a steady rhythm. White line, yellow line, steel rail. Beyond that, nothing but the suggestion of steep drop and steeper slopes. He took a sip from his travel mug, the coffee no longer hot but still strong. The caffeine sat in his veins like a quiet, steady hand on his shoulder. He wasn't bone-tired yet, just folded into that lay tower concentration, narrowed down to lane, speed, and the subtle feedback of the wheel. Ahead, a green sign loomed out of the dark, its letters shining ghostly in the beams. Mile 63. He noted it with the same casual awareness he gave every marker. This stretch was a long, slow descent into a deeper valley, the kind locals called a hollow, a place where air pooled and sound lingered. As if on cue, the mist thickened. It didn't roll in all at once, like a curtain dropping, but built itself in layers. First it lay low across the asphalt like a low, pale river, only a few inches high, the truck's lights turning it to luminous smoke. Then, as he eased down into the hollow, more gathered around, rising from the tree-choked slopes on either side. Within minutes, the world outside his glass had gone from deep black to soft gray, the beams of his headlights shortened, their edges blurred. He slowed degree by degree, letting the engine brake catch and hold on the decline. The wipers swept occasionally, pushing aside fine droplets that weren't quite rain and weren't quite nothing. In the mirrors, his own taillights painted the fog behind in hazy, muted red. The two-lane highway curved gently left, then right, winding between trunks that appeared out of the white and vanished again. Gravel shoulders narrowed against rock cuts. In places, the guardrail sat so close to the road's edge that it felt like threading a needle between steel and forest. It was at the far end of one of those curves, where the road straightened for a brief breath, that Marcus saw her. Off to the right, above the steep slope that dropped into the hollow, an old service road clung to the hillside, a narrow, half-forgotten ribbon of pavement, cracked and buckled, peppered with weeds. It ran parallel to the highway for a short distance before twisting out of sight around the hill. He'd noticed it before in daylight, the kind of leftover route you saw all through the mountains, superseded by newer engineering but still etched into the land. Tonight, a figure walked along it. At first, she was nothing but a darker smudge in the fog, something for his headlights to catch and toy with. Then a warmer color separated itself from the cold white, a pool of soft, trembling yellow light moving steadily through the mist. An old-fashioned lantern, its glass cylinder gleaming, swung from a hand at the end of a slim arm. Marcus's back straightened against the seat, shoulders drawing in. Instinctively, he eased off the accelerator again, the rig gently decelerating on the shallow downgrade. The woman, if it was a woman, moved at an unhurried pace along the broken road. Her outline was softened by the fog, but he could see the long fall of a coat or dress, hem brushing at her calves. The lantern threw just enough light up to hint at the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, but not enough for features. She was walking in the same direction he was driving, keeping to the outside edge of the service road, the little flame in her lantern burning steady despite the damp. There was no car pulled onto that old pavement, no other hint of human presence. Just her, the cracked road, and the way the light from her lantern made the fog around her glow a faint, honeyed gold. How in the world? He muttered under his breath. He flicked his eyes back to his lane. The highway demanded attention. A moment's distraction on a fog-wrapped curve could be enough to send him sliding into guardrail. When he glanced again toward the service road, she was nearly parallel with him now, lantern lifting with each step, the light swaying in a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if she and the truck moved through their own separate worlds, just close enough to sense one another but not quite touch. Then the curve swept them apart, trees shouldered in between. The service road bent away. Her light, blurred and diminishing, slipped into the whiteness and was gone. The CB had been quiet for an hour or more. Now it crackled once, a scratch of static, as though stirred by the same unease that had ghosted through him. Marcus reached out and nudged the volume up a notch, listening. Nothing followed immediately, just the faint, low hiss of the channel. He cleared his throat and picked up the mic. "Anyone else runnin' 74 East in the hollow?" he asked, voice even. "Fog's gettin' thick down around 63. Watch your corners." A beat of silence. Then a familiar voice came through, roughened by too many cigarettes and too much coffee, but touched with an easy humor. "That you Bluebird?" the man asked. "This here's Big Jim. I'm a few miles behind you, I reckon. Fog's rollin' in on me, too. You seein' what I'm seein' up on that old cut?" Marcus's fingers tightened. Around the mic. "If you're talkin' about a lady with a lantern," he said slowly, "then yeah, I'm seein' it." A low whistle threaded through Jim's chuckle. "Well now, guess you and the lantern lady are acquainted proper." "Come again?" Marcus asked. "Lantern Lady of Mile 63, Jim said, as if announcing the title of an old familiar song. She steps out on nights like this. Fog in the hollow, air sitting low. Walks that busted-up road above the drop. Seen her a couple times myself. The story was one of those things Marcus had heard in passing. Names dropped at counters. Tailies traded in murmurs when the weather pinned drivers in for an extra hour. Mountain ghosts, route guardians, odd patches of road where time got slippery. He never given them much weight. She's what? He said carefully. Somebody from a wreck. Depends who's telling it, Jim replied. Old-timers say there used to be a house down under that curve, before they widened the highway, back when it was just a skinny two-lane and not much shoulder. Woman lived there, widow, couple grandkids running around her skirts. On bad nights she'd come out with a kerosene lantern and stand by the road, swinging it slow when she heard a truck calming down. Warning, to ease off the hill. Kept more'n one logger from sliding, right into her front room, far as anyone can tell. Marcus watched the white ribbon of road unfurl, the fog thick and slow, pressing around the cab. The thought of an old woman standing out here with nothing but a lantern between her and steel and darkness settled into him with a quiet weight. What happened to her? He asked. Well, Jim said, voice softening. Story goes a driver didn't heed her one night. Too fast on the downgrade, maybe hauling wet timber. Fog just like this. She was out there swinging her light, but he never slowed. Caught the soft edge, took the guard fence and half the hillside with him. They say the truck nosed down into the hollow and the house went with it. Fire, mudslide, nobody rightly sure. When folks dug through the mess after, they never did find her for certain. Just the lantern, all busted up but the metal still smelling like kerosene. The CB went quiet for a moment, just the crackle of atmospheric noise filling the space between them. Stories get layers on M over the years, Jim added. Maybe there never was a house. Maybe there was. All I know is, on nights when the fog sits down in that spot, some of us see her walking that old road, same lantern swinging. She don't look your way. Just keeps an eye on the line of the hill like she's still guarding what used to be there. The highway bent again, hugging another contour of the hollow. Marcus's eyes flicked to the right whenever he could spare them from the lane ahead, searching for a glimpse of high, cracked pavement and that small, golden light. For a while there was nothing, just trees looming suddenly from the fog and slipping away, the guardrail's reflectors flaring up and sliding past in tidy intervals, the descent stretching on. Then, on a longer straightaway where the old service road ran nearer to the highway, he saw her again. She had gained distance somehow, far ahead of where he'd last caught sight of her. Her lantern bobbed along the outer edge of the broken pavement, its glow a steady, reassuring pulse in the amorphous white. This time, he had the impression of hair caught up at the back of her head, a silhouette maybe of a shawl thrown over her shoulders. The kind of shape you'd expect to see in an old photograph, yellowed with age. The rig closed the gap between them with the slow inevitability of gravity and diesel. As he drew closer, the light from her lantern and the light from his headlights mingled, casting overlapping circles along the fog and the wet leaves that clung to the bank. For a heartbeat, the old road and the new seemed to touch, separated by only a few yards of steep, brushy slope. He thought, though he couldn't be sure, that her pace matched his without effort. She did not appear to hurry or lag, just drifted along, timing it perfectly so that when he came level with her position, she was always a little ahead, always facing the way he was going, never allowing him to see more than the outline of her narrow back and the curve of her arm. The hair at the back of Marcus's neck prickled, not with fear in the sharp sense, but with a deep, instinctual awareness that he was sharing the road with something that did not entirely belong to his night alone. The CB crackled again. She with you still? Jim asked quietly. Up on the cut, Marcus answered, eyes on the lantern. Looks like she's leading me somewhere. Maybe she is, Jim murmured. You coming up on the tight S-curve before the bridge. It likes to slick over from all that creek mist. I'd mind her if I were you. He remembered the curve he meant. Even in clear weather it demanded respect. An abrupt right, then left, the road tilting just so over a rock outcrop, the drop to the right steeper than it had any business being so close to the guardrail. Tonight, with the fog thick and damp glossing every surface, it could be treacherous. The old service road drew nearer still, almost parallel now, the slope between them steep but not sheer. The lantern's glow intensified against the white murk, the only warm color in a world of cold, damp shades. As he approached the first bend of the S-curve, the woman's light did something it hadn't yet done. It stopped. She came to a standstill at the outside edge of the broken pavement, directly above where the highway began its first sharp right. The lantern lifted a little, held steady, rather than swinging. Marcus's chest tightened. His foot moved of its own accord, pressing down on the brake. The trailer behind him settled against the slowdown with a low, controlled groan, weight shifting forward in a way that was familiar, but never entirely comfortable. For a moment, doubt nipped at him. This was an old story, he reminded himself. The human mind was good at fitting half-seen things into old shapes. What if he was reading intent into random movement? What if easing off too sharply here made things worse, not better? Then the right-hand line of the road curved, drawn by the faint, wet gleam of paint. The fog thickened just at the apex of the turn, a denser knot that erased the outer edge of the asphalt and merged sky and void into one luminous, indistinct mass. He caught in that instant a new, darker shape in the whiteness ahead, something low and broad, too solid to be missed but too sudden to be expected. A fallen tree. It lay partly across the outer lane, its mossy trunk slick with moisture, branches still clotted with pale, winter-stripped twigs. It had come down from the steep bank above, bringing with it a scatter of rock and dirt that speckled the asphalt, in clear daylight at lower speed. It would have been an inconvenience, something to steer around cautiously. At highway speed on wet pavement in thick fog, hidden at the blind point of an S-curve, it could have been disaster. Because he had already bled off speed, because his attention had been sharpened by that small, waiting light on the hillside, Marcus had room to move. He steered gently, giving the fallen tree as much berth as the left-hand line allowed, feeling the tires bite and hold on the damp surface. The trailer followed, straight and obedient. There was a low thunk as a stray branch brushed the underside of the chassis, but nothing caught, nothing dragged. The rig slipped past the obstacle with feet to spare, then settled again into the center of the lane as the road leaned back left to complete the S. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He heard the faint rattle of something unsecured in the sleeper behind him as the truck swayed, then straightened. In his mirror, the beams of another truck bloomed in the fog behind him, high and slightly off-center. Big Jim, lagging by a reasonable 2 miles but now drawing nearer. Marcus snatched up the mic. "Tree across the right lane at the first S after 63, he said, voice tighter than he liked. "Take it slow, brother. Fog's hitting it till you're right on top." "Copy that," Jim's voice came back, instantly alert. "Seeing your brake lights now. I'll ease it down." Marcus exhaled, unclenching fingers that had pressed grooves into the steering wheel. His eyes sought the old service road again, as soon as the worst of the curve was behind him. The lantern was moving once more, but not away. It bobbed gently, as if the woman had turned to follow his progress. For the first time, he thought he saw her head cant slightly in his direction, the barest suggestion of acknowledgement in the tilt of her silhouette. The light flickered, then brightened, steadied, and lifted higher. Then, as the highway began its inevitable drift away from the hillside, the fog thickened between them like a closing curtain. When it thinned again, the service road was empty. Only the slick, cracked pavement remained, snaking along the slope into the gray. The hollow gradually widened. The creek at its base became visible at the edges of his headlights, a pale, quicksilver ribbon tumbling over rocks. The fog thinned in tatters, breaking apart and rising, leaving beads of moisture clinging to every twig and guardrail bolt. By the time Marcus passed the small green sign announcing Mile 62, the air had grown clearer, the trees standing out with sharper definition against the night. He drove on until the next pull-off, an old gravel lot beside a closed picnic area, its wooden tables barely visible as hunched shapes in the dark. He eased the rig onto the flat space and set the brake. Big Jim's headlights appeared behind him a minute later, his own truck gliding to a halt a short distance back. The two men stepped out into the cool, damp air. It smelled of wet leaves and cold creek stone, a clean, earthy scent that filled the lungs. The fog here was thin enough to see the whites of each other's eyes, the glint of chrome on their grills. "You hit that tree?" Jim asked, walking up with hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "Missed it by a whisper," Marcus said. "Wouldn't have if I hadn't already been on the brakes." Jim tipped his head back toward the curve. "She stopped for me too," he said quietly. "Second time I've had her do that. First time was years back. I listened then and it saved my hide. Looks like she's still on the job." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the hum of cooling engines filling the gap. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called once, its sound soft and questioning. "You ever see her face?" Marcus asked finally. Jim shook his head slowly. "Never quite," he said, "and I don't push my luck. I figure if she wanted us to see her full on, she'd step out on the shoulder. She keeps to that old road. That's her place. Ours is down here, trying not to leave the line she's watching over." They shared a brief, wry smile, then parted, each climbing back into his respective cocoon of glass and metal. The miles beyond the hollow unfolded with less drama. The fog lifted bit by bit, revealing more stars in the narrow strips of sky between ridges. Town lights began to appear far down the valleys, small clusters of yellow glows marking farmhouses and clusterings of older brick buildings. The road widened, straightened, became almost easy. At the next all-night diner carved into the side of the hill, Marcus stopped for coffee and a slice of pie. The interior was all formica and faded booths, the air scented with syrup and cooking oil. A handful of chairs were occupied by locals, heads bent over ceramic mugs, the low murmur of their talk smoothing into the background. The waitress, a woman with streaks of gray in her hair and a name tag that read BETTY, poured his coffee and eyed his damp jacket. "Fog bad tonight?" she asked. "Down in the hollow at 63, yeah," Marcus replied. After a beat, he added, "Ever hear of someone folks call the Lantern Lady?" Betty's expression shifted in a way that said he wasn't the first to ask. Something like fondness mixed with a tiny shiver crossed her face. "Lord, they're still talking about her," she said, setting the pot down. "My granddaddy used to swear he saw a light walk-in that old cut when he was coming back from the mines. Said it made him slow down just in time to miss a washout. Mama said it was just his nerves. But when I was a girl, my daddy'd pull over in that hollow some nights and leave a candle in the old mailbox post for her. Said you never knew when you might need someone watching the hill for you." "Mailbox?" Marcus asked. Betty smiled faintly. "Yeah, house was right under that curve once, way back when. Only thing left of it now is a rusted-out mailbox bracket set in concrete. Folks who remember leave her candles there sometimes, just cheap little ones. Most blow out or get rained on, but every now and then someone says they seen one burn longer than it had any right to." On his next run through the mountains, daylight and clear sky accompanied him. The hollow at mile 63 looked different under sun. The trees stood in shades of green and brown instead of black silhouettes, the creek a bright chattering ribbon. The old service road on the hillside was plainly visible, cracked, broken in places where frost heave had lifted it, grasses pushing through. There was no sign of recent human footprints, no visible way up without scrambling through underbrush. At the base of the curve where the S began, just beyond the guardrail, he saw it. A small, leaning square of rusted metal fixed atop a short post sunk into concrete. An old mailbox stand, long since emptied and abandoned. Around its base, half hidden in moss and last year's leaves, were the stubs of candles, white, red. Some melted almost flat by past summers. One, newer, sat in a small glass jar, its wick blackened. As his rig rolled past, sunlight caught in that little glass, making it flash briefly. For just a second, from the corner of his eye, Marcus thought it looked like a lantern's glow. He didn't stare. He didn't need to. The feeling that slid through him then was not fear, not exactly. It was something quieter, like the sense of being seen from a distance and found worth a small measure of care. He drove on, hands steady on the wheel, the hum of the engine threading through the cab. The mountains rose and fell. The road curved and straightened. The hollow lay behind, but the memory of that steady, small light on the hillside remained, lodged somewhere between his ribs and his spine. On foggy nights after that, whenever the white started to pool in the low places and creep along the guardrails, he found himself a little less alone in his thoughts. He kept a closer eye on the edges, on the places where old roads and new overlapped. And sometimes, out of habit more than belief, he'd murmur a quiet thanks under his breath when he came through a tricky stretch without trouble. If the lantern lady heard, up there on her broken strip of pavement above the hollow, she gave no sign. Her work, if that's what it was, remained as subtle as the fog itself, just a glimmer at the edge of vision, a suggestion that not every pair of watching eyes on the night road belonged to someone still among the living. Story number 6. The river didn't look like a river at all that night. It might as well have been a sky turned upside down, nothing but pale, shifting white pressed against the sides of the bridge, swallowing everything below the guardrails. The only way Alina knew there was water under her wheels was the faint, salt-heavy smell that slipped in through the vents, and the way the air felt just a little colder, a little wetter, than it had out on the inland stretches. Her rig rolled out over the causeway with a low, steady hum, the headlights pushing into the fog and disappearing almost at once. The road was a straight, narrow ribbon of concrete spanning Greywater Marsh, a few miles of elevated lanes crossing black tidal creeks, reed beds, and wide flat pools that shimmered by day and became indistinguishable void at night. Inside the cab, the world was small and warm and familiar. The dash lights painted her hands in a soft blue-green as they rested on the wheel. The vents breathed out gentle heat against her legs. The faint clink of a spoon in the empty travel mug echoed softly from the cup holder with every bump. Behind her, the sleeper held its shadowy shapes, the rumpled blanket, the netted cubby with a few paperbacks, the small battery-powered lantern clipped to a hook. The digital clock to her right glowed too, 16 a.m. It was the hour when even the late-night talk stations grew hushed. Her radio had long since drifted into static between far-off transmitters. She'd clicked it off. The CB sat quiet, the squelch set. Lo, a small green LED showing it was on and listening. The only sounds were the engine's deep, even thrum and the soft percussion of the tires over expansion joints. Thunk, 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 marking out the bridge's divided spans. Fog had been in the forecast. Ground mists in the lowlands, the meteorologist had said, cool air settling over wet ground after an unseasonably warm day. She'd driven through plenty of it before, wisps clinging in ditches, gentle veils crossing fields. But out here, with nothing to break it, the fog had pooled across the marsh and risen to wrap the bridge, coalescing into a thick, luminous wall that scraped the underside of the guardrails and curled up over the edge. Alina's world narrowed to two bright lines in the faint glow of reflective posts. The white lane stripe and the outer shoulder line, slick with moisture, caught the beams and shone back at her. Beyond them, the concrete guardrail rose and fell in a steady rhythm, droplets beating on its surface. Beyond that, nothing but gently swirling, pearly gray. She eased her speed down to 45, then 40, feeling the weight of the box trailer behind her settle into a new, more deliberate pace. The freight, a mixed load for a coastal distribution center, sat cradled and secure, but 40,000 pounds was still 40,000 pounds. On a fog-shrouded bridge over cold water, there was no sense in outrunning visibility. Her hands relaxed and re-gripped the wheel in a slow pattern, shaking off the creeping stiffness that came with late hours. Her shoulders rolled once, twice. The hum of the engine was steady, a quiet heartbeat beneath her feet. On either side, the fog glowed faintly with the same color as her headlights, but it gave nothing back in return. No hint of open water, no gleam of creek channels, no distant shore lights. The marsh, all its subtle sounds and movements, had been erased. The causeway might have been hung in empty air, miles above any ground. She'd heard the stories about this bridge. Every long-haul route had its odd patches, its favorite tailies. Greywater Causeway had one they called the Silent Mile. Old-timers at truck stop counters claimed that, on certain nights when the fog sat just right, there was a stretch near the middle where the world went quiet. Not just night quiet, no frogs, no birds, no wind, but quiet in a way that ate up even the sound of your own engine. Quiet that felt like the road was folding you into its memory, and not entirely sure if it would let you back out. She listened to the stories with a half smile, the way you listen to talk about haunted diners and phantom hitchhikers. It was part of the culture, seasoning on late-night coffee. Interesting, occasionally unsettling, rarely something she expected to meet. Still, as she drove deeper into the fog, as the shoreline behind her faded from her mirrors and the idea of land ahead became something abstract, the thought of that rumored mile curled in the back of her mind like a cat settling in. The expansion joints thunk-thunk under the tires measured out the distance. Each pair of soft impacts was like a tick on an invisible clock. She counted instinctively, 5, 10, 15 spans, then lost track as her attention drifted back to the faint hypnotic movement of mist along the guardrails. Gradually, almost too gently to notice, the sounds began to thin. First it was the wipers. They'd been making their slow, regular swish across the windshield, pushing aside the fine sheen of moisture. Now the sound dulled, as though someone had placed a thick blanket over the glass. She could see them move, could feel the faint vibration through the column, but the noise of rubber on wet glass diminished to the barest whisper. Next, the engine. Its deep, comforting rumble seemed to drop a few steps away from her. It didn't change pitch or power. The gauges stayed where they should, the rig responded as ever. But the sound of it receded, as if the cab had grown a little thicker between her and the motor. Thunk-thunk went the tires over the joints. Then even that began to fade. Alina's breath caught half a beat. She kept her face neutral, hands steady. There was no sudden plunge into silence, no dramatic switch. It was a gradual softening, the way a room full of people sounds when one conversation at a time slows, then stops. Background noise drained away until all that remained was the awareness of her own breathing and the faintest sense of vibration under her seat. The CB static, that low, constant hiss, dropped to nothing. She cleared her throat. The sound in her own ears was thin, quieter than it ought to have been. She tapped a fingernail against the steering wheel. She felt the tiny impact but hardly heard it. The world outside the windshield glowed a uniform grayish white, lit from her own beams and the diffuse reflection of their light on countless droplets. The lane lines continued ahead with hypnotic precision. The guardrails ran straight and unsympathetic. The silent mile, she thought. Something in her chest tightened, then slowly let go. It was not fear that settled over her. It was a deep, sharpened attention, like the focus that came in the seconds before a storm broke. She thought about turning on the radio just to fill the space, to prove that the speakers still worked. Instead, she reached for the CB mic, thumb pressing the transmit. "Eastbound on Greywater," she said. The words sounded oddly shaped in her own ears, their edges softened. "This is Alina in the Silver Reefer. Anybody else out here in this fog?" Silence answered at first. No crackle, no background hum. The light on the CB blinked, showing the mic was, in fact, keyed. She released it, waited a breath, then pressed again. "Checking in from the causeway," she continued, voice level. "Feels like the volume got turned down out here. "Y'all doing okay on the westbound side?" The first hint of a sound came not from the speaker, but from somewhere at the edge of hearing, like voices carried on a wind that wasn't moving. "Down to 30, can't see the lanes." "You hear that? It's like someone." "Bridge is clear, just keep." Snatches of words, layered and thin, slipped through the quiet. They did not come from the CB exactly. They seemed to float in the fog just beyond the glass, overlapping like echoes in a canyon. Then abruptly, the CB speaker itself caught. "Galena." Her name spoken in her own voice. Every muscle in her arms stiffened for a fraction of a second. She forced herself not to jerk the wheel. The sound had been faint, blurred by static, but undeniable. Her own tone, the cadence she heard on playback when dispatch left her recorded instructions. She swallowed hard. "Who's on my handle?" she said, more firmly than she felt. A wash of static answered, rising, falling, carrying with it hints of phrases that were not for her. "Left lanes blocked. Lights just went out. I don't like this, I don't." Her heart thudded once, twice, the beats loud in the muffled air. In the fog ahead, a shape began to form. Two soft, red points floated in the whiteness, faint and far, then grew slowly brighter as she closed the distance. "Tail lights." She exhaled, some small portion of tension releasing. Another vehicle on the causeway, moving in the same direction, was an anchor, a proof that she wasn't alone in this muted space. She watched the lights carefully as they hovered at the edge of visibility, matching her speed without effort. As the gap closed further, other details bled out of the fog. The faint, pale rectangle of a trailer, the suggestion of a cab. The angle of the lights put them a little higher than a car's, a little lower than some bigger rigs, but as her beams licked along the wet road surface, they caught on something else that sent a chill down through her spine in a slow, measured wash. It was the profile of the trailer itself, the way one of the upper running lights on the right flickered just slightly, the pattern of reflectors along the side. They were familiar patterns, too familiar. They matched the way her own trailer looked in her mirrors at night, the same brand, the same dent low on the rear door where someone in a warehouse had nudged it too hard with a pallet jack a year ago. She slowed another 5 miles an hour, gaze darting between the hovering red dots ahead and the image in her side mirror. In the mirror, her own taillights gleamed back through the mist, twin smudged red circles. Between them, on the lower edge of the door, she could just make out the faint shadow of that old dent. Ahead, the tail lights glowed with almost identical spacing. Now and then, as the fog swirled, a darker shape of the rear doors appeared between them. In the briefest flashes, she would have sworn she saw the same mark, the same asymmetrical scrape. The number stenciled on the upper corner of her trailer was 41,327. She couldn't see the number on the truck ahead, not in this shifting light. But her body seemed to recognize something in its silhouette even if her eyes could not quite confirm. The CB whispered, "You're right on top of it, you need to." The fragment clipped off. Alina's fingers tightened around the mic. "Unit ahead eastbound on Greywater," she called, forcing her voice to be calm. "This is Silver Reefer behind you. You got your ears on." No answer. The tail lights remained steady, hovering at the same unreachable distance, neither drawing away nor letting her close. She tapped her brake lightly, just enough for the telltale red glow to flare at the back of her own rig. In the mirror, she saw it blossom through the mist. Ahead, the twin lights flickered in perfect synchrony, as if responding. Her scalp prickled. It was like driving behind a reflection that had stepped out of the glass and onto the road. She eased the truck another mile per hour slower. The lights ahead dimmed a fraction, matching her. She rolled her shoulders, mouth dry. "Fine," she murmured under her breath. "You want to play shadow, we'll play shadow. Just keep it between the lines." The fog thickened around them, as though taking offense at the small act of defiance. The beam of her headlights seemed to shrink further, pressing the world into an even tighter tunnel. The guardrails ghosted in and out. The water below remained stubbornly absent, its presence marked only by that faint briny tang and a cold that felt as if it rose from the floor of the cab. The odd, layered whisper of voices continued just at the edge of hearing. They didn't form complete sentences, not in any way she could catch, but certain phrases floated clear now and then, like flotsam on a slow current. Slammed into the back of him, never even saw the hazard lights. Bridge crew says they thought it was clear. She thought of other nights, other bridges, news stories replayed on radios in truck stops, pileups in fog, chain reactions when one vehicle found a stopped car too late and the others behind had no time to react. The idea of it brushed past her mind like a cold hand in the dark. Ahead, the phantom trailer's lights glowed, steady and uncompromising. Her gaze slid sideways to the narrow patch of concrete dividing eastbound and westbound lanes. No one passed in the opposite direction. No oncoming lights pierced the whiteness. For a moment, she felt as if the entire causeway had been emptied of everything but her and that unknowable twin. The CB clicked softly. Her own voice drifted out, thin and distant, distorted by static. "Alina, you need to move left. There's a car dead in the right lane." Her breath stopped. It wasn't exactly her voice. It was her, but thinner, the edges of the consonants frayed, as if carried from a long way off. The words tumbled out with a quiet urgency that sank into her bones. She stared at the radio. The transmit light was dark. Her hand was not on the mic, yet she had just heard herself speak. Every rational part of her mind rebelled at the thought. Recordings, bleed through from some weird skip in the ionosphere, a dream impinging on waking life. She reached for all the explanations and found each of them sliding off the moment without quite sticking. The tail lights ahead brightened, just a fraction. Their bloom through the fog looked almost like the flare of hazard flashers. Alina's foot moved to the brake, easing the truck down, giving herself more space. The little hairs on her arms lifted as if drawn by static. Her grip on the wheel firmed. She checked the left lane. Empty, nothing but gray. She signaled out of habit and respect, then guided the rig gently over the faded dotted line into the passing lane. The phantom trailer ahead drifted the same way, its lights angling slightly left, then straightening. Her wipers continued their slow motion mute. The engine hummed somewhere a room away. The fog outside pulsed in subtle gradients, as if it shared one great, slow heartbeat. She drove that way for another tenth of a mile, feeling the bridge under her like a narrow, living thing. And then she saw it. First, there was nothing but the gray. Then, right at the very edge of her now shallow headlight reach, a darker lump began to take form in the right-hand lane. It was low and irregular, crouched on the concrete, its outlines blurred. As she closed the distance, the shape clarified into the rear of a sedan, angled slightly toward the guardrail, hazard lights winking silently into the fog. The car sat dead center in the lane, its trunk speckled with beads of moisture, its back window opaque pale with condensation. There was no movement inside that she could see, no silhouettes, no faces turning. She was already alongside when her mind caught up to what would have happened if she'd stayed in the right lane at her previous speed. The rig would have come upon that dark, unlit outline with almost no warning, brakes locking on slick concrete, trailer pushing forward with all its stubborn momentum. Maybe she would have missed it by luck, maybe not. The car slipped past her passenger side, so close she could have rolled down the window and touched the roof. In the briefest flash of reflected light, she saw that the license plate hung at a crooked angle, its metal bent as if from some previous minor impact. In the lane ahead of them, the phantom trailer's lights began to dim, as if its driver had lifted off the throttle. The twin red orbs grew fainter, smearing into the fog like watercolor. For a heartbeat, their glow pulsed in perfect time with the silent flash of the sedan's hazard lights below. Then, with a softness that made her breath catch, they went out. The lane beyond was empty. Only the pale whiteness remained, uncaring, undisturbed. Sound began to seep back into the cab by degrees. The engine's hum drew closer, the vibration under her seat reasserting itself. The faint shush of the wipers came in on the next cycle, tentative at first, then crisp. The CB static picked up its low hiss, the channel once again holding the quiet buzz of atmospheric noise. Alina realized she'd been holding her breath again and let it out slowly, air shuddering in her chest as it left. "Eastbound on Greywater, this is Alina in the reefer," she said, lifting the mic with a hand that only barely trembled. "Be advised, there's a stalled sedan in the right lane about midway across the causeway. Hazard flashers are weak in the fog. Move left and put your hazards on when you pass M if you can." The CB squawked with life almost instantly. "Copy that, Alina," came a voice, warm and familiar. Raj, who ran similar routes on a slightly different schedule. "I'm still a few miles back, but I'll keep an eye out. Fog's thick tonight, good looking out." Another driver chimed in. "Westbound side's clear, but I can see that glow through the soup. I'll call it into highway patrol when I hit the next tower. Those little cars got no business sitting, dead in the lane on a night like this." She confirmed, then hung the mic back in its cradle, fingers grazing the worn plastic almost absently. With the hazard past and the bridge still stretching ahead, she moved gently back into the right lane. The fog seemed thinner now, lifting in ragged layers. Far ahead, a faint, warm smear in the sky suggested the reflected lights of the far shore town. She glanced once into the driver's side mirror. For the briefest of moments, before the swirling white reshaped itself again, she thought she saw, far behind, another rig hanging back in the lane they just vacated. A silver reefer, identical length and height, its marker lights winking through the mist. It held there, tiny in the distance, then dissolved as if it had never been, leaving only her own taillights burning red in the white. Her chest ached in a curious, quiet way, not with pain, but with the weight of something almost like recognition. The radio crackled again, this time with more ordinary chatter, someone asking about road conditions further inland, another driver complaining about a closed ramp. The strange layered whispers had faded with the fog. The silence of the silent mile had passed, taking with it that thrumming sense of being folded into something larger and older than herself. At the end of the causeway, the concrete descended back toward earth. Tree lines reappeared out of the mist, first as vague walls, then as individual trunks. The salty tang in the air gave way to the smell of wet soil and asphalt. Ahead, the orange glow of streetlights emerged, timid at first, then more certain, sketching out the edges of an interchange. She pulled off at the first truck-friendly exit, following a familiar blue sign. Rest area, 1 mile. The short access road wound away from the marsh and into a small stand of trees. The fog stayed mostly behind on the low flats, hovering over the water like a living thing reluctant to climb. The rest area lot was half full of sleeping rigs. Sodium lights cast soft cones onto the wet pavement. Engines idled here and there, their low rumbles overlapping. A vending machine hummed. Farther off, through a band of thinner mist, the faint, steady rush of tires on the interstate marked the ongoing flow of traffic. Alina parked her truck at the edge of the lot, set the brake, and sat for a moment, letting the engine's vibrations slow down her pulse. The cab felt even more like a cocoon now, a small, loyal space that had carried her through something she didn't fully understand. Curiosity nudged. She reached up to the overhead console and pulled open the narrow plastic visor that held her registration and load paperwork. Tucked into the inner edge was a small white sticker, the trailer's ID number printed in black, 41,327. She had memorized it long ago, but seeing the digits there now, stark and ordinary, grounded her. "Still here," she said quietly to the cab itself, voice low. "Still us." Outside, fog curled at the tree line, held back as if by some unseen hand. She climbed down from the cab, boots splashing quietly through shallow puddles, and walked a slow loop around the truck, fingers trailing along the cool metal of the trailer. The dent on the lower rear door was where it had always been, the gouge in the paint jagged and familiar. When she tilted her head, she could just catch the faint roar of the causeway, far out over the marsh, where other drivers were now crossing through thinning fog. She wondered, not for the first time that night, what version of events rippled out in the layers she'd half heard in the silence. A timeline where she'd stayed in the right lane, maybe, measuring out the silent mile in a few more miles per hour, meeting the stalled car with a jolt and scream of rubber. A version of her own voice calling out on the CB to warn others afterward, or not calling at all. The thought should have unsettled her more than it did. Instead, as she finished her walk around and climbed back into the cab, a strange, quiet comfort settled over her shoulders, as tangible as a blanket. The highway remembered things, she thought. The bridges, the hollows, the long flat plains, they all held on to the impressions of what had happened upon them. The careful crossings, the narrow misses, the nights when chance and instinct and something else had aligned just enough to let heavy trucks and fragile cars pass one another unharmed. Maybe, in that thick, moving fog, the causeway had folded a few of those impressions together and given her a glimpse, a chance to choose on the safer side of the equation. She didn't know. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The road ahead would bring other nights, other stretches of white and black, other quiet miles where the only company was the hum of the engine and the whisper of the tires. But the next time the fog closed in around her cab and the world narrowed to the reach of her headlights, she suspected she would feel a little less alone. Out there, somewhere at the edge of her beams, another set of tail lights might be burning in the mist, a few seconds or a few choices ahead, quietly keeping her in between the guardrails of more than one life.